Before we begin with Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, and Strategies, I want to kind of just have a really surface level Wikipedia dive, just to see, you know, who this man is, what's he up to, why does he say the things he says, what does this mean for us, and etc, etc. Okay? Now, to begin, I've got his Wikipedia page pulled up. So it's not like, you know, I've got a script prepared or anything. We're just reading. Again, it's a reading stream. So we're reading. That's all we're doing. Nick Bostrom is a philosopher born 1973. He's currently alive. It looks like that in 2020. Is a philosopher known for his work on existential risk, the anthropic principle, human enhancement ethics, whole brain emulation, superintelligence risks, and the reversal tests. He was the founding director of the now dissolved Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford and is now principal researcher at MacroStrategy Research Initiative. Bostrom is the author of Anthropic Bias, Observation, Selection, Effects in Science and Philosophy, Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, Strategies, and Deep Utopia, Life and Meaning in a Solved World. Bostrom believes that advances in artificial intelligence may lead to superintelligence, which he defines as any intellect that greatly exceeds the cognitive performances of humans in virtually all domains of interest. He views this as a major source of opportunities and existential risks. So, just quickly, first thing is he's aged 52, so he's younger than me by about 8 years. And he's accomplished a lot more, so it is what it is, right? But secondly, his work is pretty interesting. Existential risk, right? Do you see the pop-up when I like hover over a word? Yes, you do. You do see that. Okay. A global catastrophic risk or doomsday scenario, a hypothetical event that damages human well-being on a global scale, endangering or even destroying modern civilization. Existential risk is a related term limited to events that could cause full-blown human extinction. So all of your Terminator concerns or whatever, however many AI apocalyptic movies, right? That's his work. That's what he's doing. The anthropic principle, which is the observation selection effect. It's like I'll click into it. It's the proposition that the range of possible observations that could be made about the universe is limited by the fact that observations are only possible in the type of universe that is capable of developing observers in the first place. So, yeah. The range of possible observations that can be made about the universe, the range of it seems unlimited, right? Because, like, if I ask you, how many observations can we make about the universe? You're like, you know, the possibilities are endless. But the possibilities are actually not that endless in the fact that they're limited by the fact that the observations can only be possible in the type of universe that develops observers in the first place. So if a universe does not develop any observers, then there, you know, can be no observations made. If in another way to put it. Proponents of this argue that it explains why the universe has the age and fundamental physical constants necessary to accommodate intelligent life. If it's been really different, no one would be around to make observations. So it's sort of a way to explain why the universe is the way it is. Because right now we just think, oh, didn't it just kind of happen to be the way it is? But through this principle, people argue that, oh, well, it's actually because, you know, we're biased in the sense that, or these observations are biased in the sense that they require someone to do the observing in the first place. There's like a ton of stuff beyond this, but it's just kind of a cool concept. Anyways, that's not the main thing though. Human enhancement ethics, so cyborg. I don't know what else to say. This is a very intro. This isn't even a 101 intro. This is just like this is just we're reading something and you need to have no prior knowledge of it. He looks like Jason Statham. Okay, we're ignoring that. Whole brain emulation, mind uploading, so it's like the whole uploading your brain to the cloud or a computer or whatever. Superintelligence risks, that's the main thing for today. And the reversal test. This is pretty cool. The reversal test is something I read like just now for a little bit as I was kind of scrolling through, and I thought it was interesting. The test is basically to spot. It's designed to, excuse me, hold on. Sorry, I had a very nasty burp, and I don't think you wanted to hear that. So anyways, the reversal test is a heuristic designed to spot and eliminate status quo bias, an emotional bias irrationally favoring the current state of affairs. The test is applicable to the evaluation of any decision involving a potential deviation from the status quo along some continuous dimension. It was introduced in the context of bioethics of human enhancement. So basically the idea is, the reversal test... hold on, I'll just read it. Bostrom and Ord introduced the reversal test to provide an answer to the question of how we can, given that humans might suffer from irrational status quo bias, distinguish between valid criticisms of a proposed increase in some human trait and criticisms merely motivated by resistance to change. The reversal test attempts to do this by asking whether it would be a good thing if the trait was decreased. An example given is that if someone objects that an increase in intelligence would be a bad thing due to more dangerous weapons being made, etc., the objector to the position then asks, shouldn't we decrease intelligence then? So when, in other words, when there's a proposal made to change something, to increase something or decrease something, in order to distinguish between valid criticisms and people who have positions who are just irrationally holding on to status quo, we ask, well, okay, are you arguing against this change because you want everything to be the way it is right now? So in this case, you have a status quo bias. Or do you just think that thing is, do you actually think that thing is bad? In which case, should we, and in order to know that, we can just ask, should we do the opposite then? So if you're trying to say, oh, should we increase funding for schools? And someone says, no, we shouldn't. Then you ask them, oh, then are you saying we should decrease funding for schools then? And if they go, oh, well, no, not really, then you can see that their criticisms, then it's not like, you know, obviously it's merely a heuristic. It's a heuristic test, right? But it's a heuristic test you can use to spot if someone is clinging on to the way things are just because of the status quo, right? And then there's, you know, further bits of this, and then there's criticisms of this, of course. And then Alfred Nordman argues that there merely erects a straw man argument in favor of enhancement, claims the tests are limited to approaches that are consequentialist and deontological. So those are the two. If you want a quick and dirty of consequentialism and deontology, it's the two branches of the trolley problem, okay? One that's like how many lives you save, and one that's like, okay, but you're pulling the lever. That's the thing, okay? That's the quick and dirty of it. And then, you know, there's obviously proponents' criticism. But I just thought it was an interesting, like, heuristic concept. It's kind of cool. Oh, the institute he founded got shut down. That's interesting. The Future of Humanity Institute. Well, anyways. Some things, I think he's cooking. Some things, I don't know if he's cooking so much. Now, what those things are, I can't really specify entirely because I'm not, like, versed enough in his philosophy to give you a good answer for what he does. I can just tell you, though, that he is probably a bit more enthusiastic about uploading our brains to the cloud than I am. So, you know, there you go. But I'm going to put aside, you know, all of that and come back to this some 30-something minutes after I started stream. And we're actually going to read him completely. Or I'm going to try to do that. There's a few chapters in the book. I'm going to read, like... There's actually a lot of pages in this book. There's like 400 pages in this book. I don't know if we'll be able to read all of them. But I want to, like, make at least a good effort into, you know, chunking some of it down. Today, of course, we're reading the foreword and chapter 1. That's all we're doing. Now, without further ado, Superintelligence. Let me try again. Superintelligence. Paths, Dangers, Strategies by Nick Bostrom. This is in 2014. Yep. The Unfinished Fable of the Sparrows. It was the nest building season, but after days of long hard work, the sparrows sat in the evening glow, relaxing and chirping away. We are all so small and weak. Imagine how easy life would be if we had an owl who could help us build our nests. Yes, said another, and we could use it to look after our elderly and our young. It could give us advice and keep an eye out for the neighborhood cat, added a third. Then past us, the elder bird spoke. Let us send out scouts in all directions and try to find an abandoned owlet somewhere, or maybe an egg. A crow chick might also do, or a baby weasel. This could be the best thing that ever happened to us, at least since the opening of the pavilion of unlimited grain in yonder backyard. The flock was exhilarated, and sparrows everywhere started chirping at the top of their lungs. Only Skronkfinkel, a one-eyed sparrow with a fretful temperament, was unconvinced of the wisdom of the endeavor. Quoth he, "This will surely be our undoing. Should we not give some thought to the art of owl domestication and owl taming first, before we bring such a creature into our midst?" Replied Pastis, "Taming an owl sounds like an exceedingly difficult thing to do. It will be difficult enough to find an owl egg, so let us start there. After we have succeeded in raising an owl, then we can think about taking on this other challenge." "There's a flaw in that plan," squeaked Skronkfinkel, but his protests were in vain, as the flock had already lifted off to start implementing the directive set out by Pastis. Just 2 or 3 sparrows remained behind. Together they began to try to work out how owls might be tamed or domesticated. They soon realized that Pastis had been right. This was an exceedingly difficult challenge, especially in the absence of an actual owl to practice on. Nevertheless, they pressed on as best they could, constantly fearing that the flock might return with an owl egg before a solution to the control problem had been found. It is not known how the story ends, but the author dedicates this book to Skronkfinkel and his followers. That's cute. Preface. Inside your cranium is the thing that does the reading. This thing, the human brain, has some capabilities that the brains of other animals lack. It is to these distinctive capabilities that we owe our dominant position on the planet. Other animals have stronger muscles and sharper claws, but we have cleverer brains. Our modest advantage in general intelligence has led us to develop language, technology, and complex social organization. The advantage is compounded over time, as each generation has built on the achievements of its predecessors. If someday we build machine brains that surpass human brains in general intelligence, then this new superintelligence could become very powerful. And as the fate of the gorillas now depend more on us humans than on the gorillas themselves, so the fate of our species would depend on the actions of the machine superintelligence. We do have one advantage. We get to build this stuff. In principle, we could build a kind of superintelligence that would protect human values. We would certainly have strong reasons to do so. In practice, the control problem, the problem of how to control what the superintelligence would do, looks quite difficult. It also looks like we will only get one chance. Once unfriendly superintelligence exists, it would prevent us from replacing it or changing its preferences. Our fate would be sealed. In this book, I try to understand the challenge presented by the prospect of superintelligence and how we might best respond. This is quite possibly the most important and most daunting challenge humanity has ever faced. And, whether we succeed or fail, it is probably the last challenge we will ever face. It is no part of the argument in this book that we are on the threshold of a big breakthrough in artificial intelligence, or that we can predict with any precision when such a development might occur. It seems somewhat likely that it will happen sometime in this century, but we don't know for sure. The first couple of chapters do discuss possible pathways and say something about the question of timing. The bulk of the book, however, is about what happens after. We study the kinetics of an intelligence explosion, the forms and powers of superintelligence, and the strategic choices available to a superintelligent agent that attains a decisive advantage. We then shift our focus to the control problem and ask what we could do to shape the world, shape the initial conditions, so as to achieve a survivable and beneficial outcome. Toward the end of the book, we zoom out and contemplate the larger picture that emerges from our investigations. Some suggestions are offered on what ought to be done now to increase our chances of avoiding an existential catastrophe later. This has not been an easy book to write. I hope the path that has been cleared will enable other investigators to reach the new frontier more swiftly and conveniently, so that they can arrive there fresh and ready to join the work to further expand the reach of our comprehension. And if the way that has been made is a little bumpy and bendy, I hope that reviewers, in judging the result, will not underestimate the hostility of the terrain ex ante. This has not been an easy book to write. I've tried to make it an easy book to read, but I don't think I've quite succeeded. When writing, I had in mind as the target audience an earlier time slice of myself, and I tried to produce the kind of book that I would have enjoyed reading. This could prove a narrow demographic. Nevertheless, I think that the content should be accessible to many people, if they put some thought into it and resist the temptation to instantaneously misunderstand each new idea by assimilating it with the most similar sounding cliché available in their cultural larders. Non-technical readers should not be discouraged by the occasional bit of mathematics or specialized vocabulary, for it is always possible to glean the main point from the surrounding explanations. Conversely, for those readers who want more of the nitty-gritty, there's quite a lot to be found among the endnotes. Many of the points made in this book are probably wrong. It is also likely that there are considerations of critical importance that I failed to take into account, thereby invalidating some or all of my conclusions. I've gone to some length to indicate nuances and degrees of uncertainty throughout the text, encumbering it with an unsightly smudge of possibly, might, may, could well, it seems, probably, very likely, almost certainly. Each qualifier has been placed where it is carefully and deliberately. Yet these topical applications of epistemic modesty are not enough. They must be supplemented here by a systemic admission of uncertainty and fallibility. This is not false modesty, for while I believe that my book is likely to be seriously wrong and misleading, I think that the alternative views that have been presented in the literature are substantially worse, including the default view, or null hypothesis, according to which we can for the time being safely, or reasonably, ignore the prospect of superintelligence. Bear in mind, this was written in 2014. Okay. There's a ton of acknowledgements. We're going to ignore them. List of contents. Past developments and present capabilities. Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Paths to superintelligence. Chapter 3. Forms of superintelligence. Chapter 4. The kinetics of an intelligence explosion. Chapter 5. Decisive strategic advantage. Chapter 6. Cognitive superpowers. Chapter 7. The superintelligent will. Chapter 8. Is the default outcome doom? Chapter 9, the control problem. Chapter 10, Oracle's genies, sovereigns, tools. Chapter 11, multipolar scenarios. Chapter 12, acquiring values. Chapter 13, choosing the criteria for choosing. Chapter 14, the strategic picture. Chapter 15, crunch time. Ooh. Okay, let's start with chapter 1. Chapter 1. Past developments and present capabilities. We begin by looking back. History, at the largest scale, seems to exhibit a sequence of distinct growth modes, each much more rapid than its predecessor. This pattern has been taken to suggest that another, even faster, growth mode might be possible. However, we do not place much weight on this observation. This is not a book about technological acceleration or exponential growth or the miscellaneous notions sometimes gathered under the rubric of the singularity. Next, we review the history of artificial intelligence. We then survey the field's current capabilities. Finally, we glance at some recent expert opinion surveys and contemplate our ignorance about the timeline of future advances. Again, bear in mind, this was written in 2014. Growth modes and big history. A mere few million years ago, our ancestors were still swinging from the branches in the African canopy. On a geological or even evolutionary timescale, the rise of Homo sapiens from our last common ancestor with the great apes happened swiftly. We developed upright posture, opposable thumbs, and, crucially, some relatively minor changes in brain size and neurological organization that led to a great leap in cognitive ability. As a consequence, humans can think abstractly, communicate complex thoughts, and culturally accumulate information over the generations far better than any other species on the planet. These capabilities let humans develop increasingly efficient productive technologies, making it possible for our ancestors to migrate far away from the rainforest and the savanna, especially after the adoption of agriculture. Population densities rose along with the total size of the human population. More people meant more ideas. Greater densities meant that ideas could spread more readily and that some individuals could devote themselves to developing specialized skills. These developments increased the rate of growth of economic productivity and technological capacity. Later developments related to the Industrial Revolution brought about a second comparable step change in the rate of growth. Such changes in the rate of growth have important consequences. A few 100,000 years ago, in early human or hominid prehistory, growth was so slow that it took on the order of 1 million years for human productive capacity to increase sufficiently to sustain an additional 1 million individuals living at subsistence level. By 5000 BC, following the agricultural revolution, the rate of growth had increased to the point where the same amount of growth took just 2 centuries. Today, following the Industrial Revolution, the world economy grows on average by that amount every 90 minutes. Even the present rate of growth will produce impressive results if maintained for a moderately long time. If the world economy continues to grow at the same pace as it has over the past 50 years, then the world will be some 4.8 times richer by 2050 and about 34 times richer by 2100 than it is today. Yet the prospect of continuing on a steady exponential growth path pales in comparison to what would happen if the world were to experience another step change in the rate of growth, comparable in magnitude to those associated with the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. The economist Robin Hanson estimates, based on historical, economic, and population data, a characteristic world economy doubling time for Pleistocene hunter-gatherer society, Pleistocene? Society of 224,000 years, for farming society 909 years, and for industrial society 6.3 years. In Hanson's model, the present epoch is a mixture of the farming and industrial growth modes. The world economy as a whole is not yet growing at the 6.3-year doubling rate. If another such transition to a different growth mode were to occur, and it were of a similar magnitude to the previous two, it would result in a new growth regime in which the world economy would double in size about every 2 weeks. Such a growth rate seems fantastic by current lights. Observers in earlier epochs might have found it equally preposterous to suppose that the world economy would one day be doubling several times within a single lifespan. Yet that is the extraordinary condition we now take to be ordinary. The idea of a coming technological singularity has by now been widely popularized, starting with Werner Vinge's seminal essay and continuing with the writings of Ray Kurzweil and others. The term singularity, however, has been used confusedly in many disparate senses and has accreted yet an unholy, almost millenarian aura of techno-utopian connotations. Since most of these meanings and connotations are irrelevant to our argument, we can gain clarity by dispensing with the singularity word in favor of more precise terminology. The singularity-related idea that interests us here is the possibility of an intelligence explosion, particularly the prospect of machine superintelligence. There may be those who are persuaded by growth diagrams, like the ones in Figure 1, that another drastic change in growth mode is in the cards, comparable to the agricultural or industrial revolution. These folk may then reflect that it is hard to conceive of a scenario in which the world economy's doubling time shortens to mere weeks that does not involve the creation of minds that are much faster and more efficient than the familiar biological kind. However, the case for taking seriously the prospect of a machine intelligence revolution need not rely on curve-fitting exercises or extrapolations from past economic growth. As we shall see, there are stronger reasons for taking heed. Figure 1. Long-term history of world GDP. Plotted on a linear scale, the history of the world economy looks like a flat line hugging the x-axis until it suddenly spikes vertically upward. Even when we zoom in on the most recent 10,000 years, the pattern remains essentially one of a single 90-degree angle. B. Only within the past 100 years or so does the curve lift perceptibly above the zero level. The different lines in the plot correspond to different datasets, which yield slightly different estimates. So, this is if we really look at the cosmic big scale of humanity, this is where it would be. But if we zoom in B here from the 1700s, it still looks very much like that. It's fascinating how it came to be, this industrial revolution. Anyways, Great Expectations. Machines matching humans in general intelligence, that is, possessing common sense and an effective ability to learn, reason, and plan to meet complex information processing challenges across a wide range of natural and abstract domains, have been expected since the invention of computers in the 1940s. At the time, the advent of such machines was often placed some 20 years into the future. Since then, the expected arrival date has been receding at a rate of 1 year per year, so that today, futurists who concern themselves with the possibility of artificial general intelligence still often believe that intelligent machines are a couple of decades away. 2 decades is a sweet spot for prognosticators of radical change, near enough to be attention-grabbing and relevant, but yet far enough to make it possible to suppose that a string of breakthroughs, currently only vaguely imaginable, might by then have occurred. Contrast this with shorter timescales. Most technologies that will have a big impact on the world in 5 or 10 years from now are already in limited use, while technologies that will reshape the world in less than 15 years probably exist as laboratory prototypes. "20 years may also be close to the typical duration remaining of a forecaster's career, bounding the reputational risk of a bold prediction. From the fact that some individuals have overpredicted artificial intelligence in the past, however, it does not follow that AI is impossible or will never be developed. The main reason why progress has been slower than expected is that the technical difficulties of constructing intelligent machines have proved greater than the pioneers foresaw. But this leaves open just how great those difficulties are and how far we now are from overcoming them. Sometimes, a problem that initially looks hopelessly complicated turns out to have a surprisingly simple solution, though the reverse is probably more common. In the next chapter, we will look at different paths that may lead to a human-level machine intelligence. But let us note at the outset that however many stops there are between here and human-level machine intelligence, the latter is not the final destination. The next stop, just a short distance farther along the tracks, is superhuman-level machine intelligence. The train might not pause or even decelerate at Humanville Station. It is likely to swoosh right by. The mathematician I.J. Good, who had served as chief statistician in Alan Turing's code-breaking team in World War II, might have been the first to enunciate the essential aspects of this scenario. In an oft-quoted passage from 1965, he wrote, "Let an ultra-intelligent machine be defined as a machine that can surpass all the intelligent activities of any man, however clever." Since the design of machines is one of these intellectual activities, an ultra-intelligent machine could design even better machines. There would then unquestionably be an intelligence explosion, and the intelligence of man would be left far behind. Thus, the first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention that man need ever make, provided that the machine is docile enough to tell us how to keep it under control. It may seem obvious now that major existential risks would be associated with such an intelligence explosion, and that the prospect should therefore be examined with the utmost seriousness, even if it were known, which it is not, to have but a moderately small probability of coming to pass. The pioneers of artificial intelligence, however, notwithstanding their belief in the imminence of human-level AI, mostly did not contemplate the possibility of greater-than-human AI. It is as though their speculation muscle had so exhausted itself in conceiving the radical possibility of machines reaching human intelligence that it could not grasp the corollary. that machines would subsequently become superintelligent. The AI pioneers, for the most part, did not countenance the possibility that their enterprise might involve risk. They gave no lip service, let alone serious thought, to any safety concern or ethical qualm related to the creation of artificial minds and potential computer overlords. A lacuna that astonishes even against the background of the era's not so impressive standards of critical technology assessment. We must hope that by the time the enterprise eventually does become feasible, we will have gained not only the technological proficiency to set off an intelligence explosion, but also the higher level of mastery that may be necessary to make the detonation survivable. But before we turn to what lies ahead, it will be useful to take a quick glance at the history of machine intelligence to date. Seasons of Hope and Despair. In the summer of 1956 at Dartmouth College, 10 scientists share an interest in neural nets, automata theory, and the study of intelligence convened for a 6-week workshop. This Dartmouth summer project is often regarded as the cockcrow of artificial intelligence as a field of research. Many of the participants would later be recognized as founding figures. The optimistic outlook among the delegates is reflected in the proposal submitted to the Rockefeller Foundation, which provided funding for the event. We propose that a 2-month, 10-man study of artificial intelligence be carried out. The study is to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning, or any other feature of intelligence, can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. An attempt will be made to find out how to make machines that use language, form abstractions and concepts, solve kinds of problems now reserved for humans, and improve themselves. We think that a significant advance can be made in one or more of these problems if a carefully selected group of scientists work on it together for a summer. In the 6 decades since this brash beginning, the field of artificial intelligence has been through periods of hype and high expectations, alternating with periods of setback and disappointment. The first period of excitement, which began with the Dartmouth meeting, was later described by John McCarthy, the event's main organizer, as the "look ma, no hands" era. During these early days, researchers built systems designed to refute claims of the form, "no machine could ever do X." Such skeptical claims were common at the time. To counter them, the AI researchers created small systems that achieved X in a microworld, a well-defined, limited domain that enabled a pared-down version of the performance to be demonstrated, thus providing a proof of concept and showing that X could, in principle, be done by machine. One such early system, the logic theorist, was able to prove most of the theorems in the second chapter of Whitehead and Russell's Principia Mathematica, and even came up with one proof that was much more elegant than the original, thereby debunking the notion that machines could only think numerically, and showing that machines were also able to do deduction and invent logical proofs. I did not know that. That's interesting. A follow-up program, the general problem solver, could in principle solve a wide range of formally specified problems. Programs that could solve calculus problems, typical of first-year college courses, visual analogy problems of the type that appear in some IQ tests, and simple verbal algebra problems were also written. The shaky robot, so named because of its tendency to tremble during operation, demonstrated how logical reasoning could be integrated with perception and used to plan and control physical activity. The ELIZA program showed how a computer could impersonate a Rogerian psychotherapist. In the mid-70s, the program SHR DLU showed how a simulated robotic arm in a simulated world of geometric blocks could follow instructions and answer questions in English that were typed in by a user. In later decades, systems would be created that demonstrated that machines could compose music in the style of various classical composers, outperform junior doctors in certain clinical diagnostic tasks, drive cars autonomously, and make patentable inventions. There has even been an AI that cracked original jokes. Not that its level of humor was high. What do you get when you cross an optic with a mental object? An idea. But children reportedly found its puns consistently entertaining. The methods that produced successes in the early demonstration systems often proved difficult to extend to a wider variety of problems or to harder problem instances. One reason for this is the combinatorial explosion of possibilities that must be explored by methods that rely on something like exhaustive speech. Such methods work well for simple instances of a problem, but fail when things get a bit more complicated. For instance, to prove a theorem that has a 5-line long proof in a deduction system, with one inference rule and 5 axioms, one could simply enumerate the 3,125 possible combinations and check each one to see if it delivers the intended conclusion. Exhaustive search would also work for 6- and 7-line proofs, but as the task becomes more difficult, the method of exhaustive search soon runs into trouble. Proving a theorem with a 50-line proof does not take 10 times longer than proving a theorem that has a 5-line proof. Rather, if one uses exhaustive search, it requires combing through 5 to the power of 50, which roughly equals 8.9 times 10 to the power of 34 possible sequences, which is computationally infeasible even with the fastest supercomputers. To overcome the combinatorial explosion, one needs algorithms that exploit structure in the target domain and take advantage of prior knowledge by using heuristic search, planning, and flexible abstract representations. Capabilities that were poorly developed in the early AI systems. The performance of these early systems also suffered because of poor methods for handling uncertainty, reliance on brittle and ungrounded symbolic representations, data scarcity, and severe hardware limitations on memory capacity and processor speed. By the mid-1970s, there was a growing awareness of these problems. The realization that many AI projects could never make good on their initial promise led to the onset of the first AI winter, a period of retrenchment during which funding decreased and skepticism increased and AI fell out of fashion. A new springtime arrived in the early 1980s when Japan launched its 5th-generation computer systems project, a well-funded public-private partnership that aimed to leapfrog the state-of-the-art by developing a massively parallel computing architecture that would serve as a platform for artificial intelligence. This occurred at peak fascination with the Japanese post-war economic miracle, a period when Western government and business leaders anxiously sought to divine the formula behind Japan's economic success, in hope of replicating the magic at home. When Japan decided to invest big in AI, several other countries followed suit. The ensuing years saw a great proliferation of expert systems. Designed to support tools for decision makers, expert systems were rule-based programs that made simple inferences from a knowledge base of facts, which had been elicited from human domain experts and painstakingly hand-coded in a formal language. Hundreds of these expert systems were built. However, the smaller systems provided little benefit, and the larger ones were expensive to develop, validate, and keep updated, and were generally cumbersome to use. It was impractical to acquire a standalone computer just for the sake of running one program. By the late 1980s, this growth season 2 had run its course. The 5th-generation project failed to meet its objectives, as did its counterparts in the United States and Europe. A second AI winter descended. At this point, a critic could justifiably bemoan the history of artificial intelligence research to date, consisting always of very limited success in particular areas, followed immediately by a failure to reach the broader goals at which these initial successes seemed, at first, to hint. Private investors began to shun any venture carrying the brand of artificial intelligence. Even among academics and their funders, AI became an unwanted epithet. Technical work continued apace, however, and by the 1990s, the second AI winter gradually thawed. Optimism was rekindled by the introduction of new techniques which seemed to offer alternatives to the traditional logicist paradigm, often referred to as good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, or GOFAI for short, which had focused on high-level simple manipulation and which had reached its apogee in the expert systems of the 1980s. The newly popular techniques, which included neural networks and genetic algorithms, promised to overcome some of the shortcomings of the GOFAI approach, in particular the brittleness that characterized classical AI programs, which typically produced complete nonsense if the programmers made even a single slightly erroneous assumption. The new techniques boasted a more organic performance. For example, neural networks exhibited the property of graceful degradation. A small amount of damage to a neural network typically resulted in a small degradation of its performance, rather than a total crash. Even more importantly, neural networks could learn from experience, finding natural ways of generalizing from examples and finding hidden statistical patterns in their output. This made the nets good at pattern recognition and classification problems. For example, by training a neural network on a dataset of sonar signals, it could be taught to distinguish the acoustic profiles of submarines, mines, and sea life with better accuracy than human experts. And this could be done without anybody at first having to figure out in advance exactly how the categories were to be defined or how different features were to be weighed. While simple neural network models have been known since the late 1950s, the field enjoyed a renaissance after the introduction of the backpropagation algorithm, which made it possible to train multi-layered neural networks. Such multi-layered networks, which have one or more intermediary hidden layers of neurons between the input and output layers, can learn a much wider range of functions than their simpler predecessors. Combined with the increasingly powerful computers that were becoming available, these algorithmic improvements enabled engineers to build neural networks that were good enough to be practically useful in many applications. The brain-like qualities of neural networks contrasted favorably with the rigidly logic-chopping but brittle performance of traditional rule-based GoFi systems, enough so to inspire a new ism, a connectionism, which emphasized the importance of massively parallel, sub-symbolic processing. More than 150,000 academic papers have since been published on artificial neural networks, and they continue to be an important approach in machine learning. Evolution-based methods such as genetic algorithms and genetic programming constitute another approach whose emergence helped end the second AI winter. It made perhaps a smaller academic impact than neural nets, but was widely popularized. In evolutionary models, a population of candidate solutions, which can be data structures or programs, is maintained, and new candidate solutions are generated randomly by mutating or recombining variants in the existing population. Periodically, the population is pruned by applying a selection criterion, a fitness function, that allows only the better candidates to survive into the next generation. Iterated over thousands of generations, the average quality of the solutions in the candidate pool gradually increases. When it works, this kind of algorithm can produce efficient solutions to a very wide range of problems, solutions that may be strikingly novel and unintuitive, often looking more like natural structures than anything that a human engineer would design. And in principle, this can happen without much need for human input beyond the initial specification of the fitness function, which is often very simple. In practice, however, getting evolutionary methods to work well requires skill and ingenuity, particularly in devising a good representational format. Without an efficient way to encode candidate solutions, a genetic language that matches latent structure in the target domain, evolutionary search tends to meander endlessly in a vast search for space or get stuck at a local optimum. Even if a good representational format is found, evolution is computationally demanding and is often defeated by the combinatorial explosion. Neural networks and genetic algorithms are examples of methods that stimulated excitement in the 1990s by appearing to offer alternatives to the stagnating GOFAI paradigm. But the intention here is not to sing the praises of these two methods or to elevate them above the many other techniques in machine learning. In fact, one of the major theoretical developments of the past 20 years has been a clear realization of how superficially disparate techniques can be understood as special cases within a common mathematical framework. For example, many types of artificial neural network can be viewed as classifiers that perform a particular kind of statistical calculation, maximum likelihood estimation. This perspective allows neural nets to be compared with a larger class of algorithms for learning classifiers from examples, decision trees, logistical regression models, support vector machines, naive Bayes, k-nearest neighbors regression, among others. In a similar manner, genetic algorithms can be viewed as performing stochastic hill climbing, which is again a subset of a wider class of algorithms for optimization. Each of these algorithms for building classifiers or for searching a solution space has its own profile of strengths and weaknesses, which can be studied mathematically. Algorithms differ in their processor time and memory space requirements, which inductive biases they presuppose, the ease with which externally produced content can be incorporated, and how transparent their inner workings are to a human analyst. Behind the razzle-dazzle of machine learning and creative problem-solving thus lies a set of mathematically well-specified trade-offs. The ideal is that of the perfect Bayesian agent, one that makes probabilistically optimal use of available information. This ideal is unattainable because it is too computationally demanding to be implemented in any physical computer. See Box 1. Accordingly, one can view artificial intelligence as a quest to find shortcuts, ways of tractably approximating the Bayesian ideal by sacrificing some optimality or generality while preserving enough to get high performance in the actual domains of interest. A reflection on this picture can be seen in the work done over the past couple of decades on probabilistic graphical models, such as Bayesian networks. Bayesian networks provide a concise way of representing probabilistic and conditional independence relations that hold in some particular domain. Exploiting such independence relations is essential for overcoming the combinatorial explosion, which is as much of a problem for probabilistic inference as it is for logical deduction. They also provide important insight into the concept of causality. One advantage of relating learning problems from specific domains to the general problem of Bayesian inference is that new algorithms that make Bayesian inference more efficient will then yield immediate improvements across many different areas. Advances in Monte Carlo approximation techniques, for example, are directly applied in computer vision, robotics, and computational and genetics. Another advantage is that it lets researchers from different disciplines more easily pool their findings. Graphical models and Bayesian statistics have become a shared focus of research in many fields, including machine learning, statistical physics, bioinformatics, combinatorial optimization, and communication theory. A fair amount of the recent progress in machine learning has resulted from incorporating formal results originally derived in other academic fields. Machine learning applications have also benefited enormously from faster computers and greater availability of large datasets. Box 1. An optimal Bayesian agent. An ideal Bayesian agent starts out with a prior probability distribution, a function that assigns probabilities to each possible world, i.e. to each maximally specific way the world could turn out to be. This prior incorporates an inductive bias such that simpler possible worlds are assigned higher probabilities. One way to formally define the simplicity of a possible world is in terms of its Kolmogorov complexity, a measure based on the length of the shortest computer program that generates a complete description of the world. The prior also incorporates any background knowledge that the programmers wish to give to the agent. As the agent receives new information from its sensors, it updates its probability distribution by conditionalizing the distribution on the new information according to Bayes' theorem. Conditionalization is the mathematical operation that sets the new probability of those worlds that are inconsistent with the information received to 0 and renormalizes the probability distribution over the remaining possible worlds. The result is a posterior probability distribution, which the agent may use as its new prior in the next time step. As the agent makes observations, its probability mass thus gets concentrated on the shrinking set of possible worlds that remain consistent with the evidence, and among these possible worlds, simpler ones always have more probability. Metaphorically, we can think of a probability as sand on a large sheet of paper. The paper is partitioned into areas of various sizes, each area corresponding to one possible world, with larger areas corresponding to simpler possible worlds. Imagine also a layer of sand of even thickness spread across the entire sheet. This is our prior probability distribution. Whenever an observation is made that rules out some possible worlds, we remove the sand from the corresponding areas of the paper and redistribute it evenly over the areas that remain in play. Thus, the total amount of sand on the sheet never changes, it just gets concentrated into fewer areas as observational evidence accumulates. This is a picture of learning in its purest form. To calculate the probability of a hypothesis, we simply measure the amount of sand in all of the areas that correspond to the possible world in which the hypothesis is true. So far, we have defined a new learning rule. To get an agent, we also need a decision rule. To this end, we endow the agent with a utility function, which assigns a number to each possible world. The number represents the desirability of that world according to the agent's basic preferences. Now, at each time step, the agent selects the action with the highest expected utility. To find the action with the highest expected utility, the agent can list all possible actions. It could then compute the conditional probability distribution given the action, the probability distribution that would result from conditionalizing its current probability distribution on the observation that the action had just been taken. Finally, it could calculate the expected value of the action as the sum of the value of each possible world multiplied by the conditional probability of that world given the action. The learning rule and the decision rule together define an optimality notion for an agent. Essentially, the same optimality notion has been broadly used in artificial intelligence, epistemology, philosophy of science, economics, and statistics. In reality, it is impossible to build such an agent because it is computationally intractable to perform the requisite calculations. Any attempt to do so succumbs to a combinatorial explosion, just like the one described in our discussions of GeoFAI. To see why this is so, consider one tiny subset of all possible worlds, those that consist of a single computer monitor floating in an endless vacuum. The monitor has 1000 by 1000 pixels, each of which is perpetually either on or off. Even this subset of possible worlds is enormously large. The 2 to the power of 1000 times 1000 possible monitor states outnumber all the computations expected ever to take place in the observable universe. Thus, we cannot even enumerate all the possible worlds in this tiny subset of all possible worlds, let alone perform more elaborate computations on each of them individually. Optimality notions can be of theoretical interest, even if they are physically unrealizable. They give us a standard by which to judge heuristic approximations, and sometimes we can reason about what an optimal agent would do in some special case. We will encounter some alternative optimality notions for artificial agents in Chapter 12. Now, returning to this chapter, state of the art. Artificial intelligence already outperforms human intelligence in many domains. Table 1 surveys the state of game-playing computers, showing that AIs now beat human champions in a wide range of games. These achievements may not seem impressive today, but this is because our standards for what is impressive keep adapting to the advances being made. Expert chess playing, for example, was once thought to epitomize human intellection. In the view of several experts in the late 50s, if one could devise a successful chess machine, one would seem to have penetrated to the core of human intellectual endeavor. This no longer seems so. One sympathizes with John McCarthy, who lamented, "As soon as it works, no one calls it AI anymore." Table 1. Game-playing AI. Checkers. Superhuman. Arthur Samuel's Checkers program, originally written in 1952, later improved, becomes the first program to learn to play a game better than its creator. In 1994, the program Chinook beats the reigning champion, making the first time a program wins an official world championship in a game of skill. In 2002, John Schaefer and his team Solve Checkers produce a program that always makes the best possible move, combining alpha-beta search with a database of 39 trillion endgame positions. Perfect play by both sides leads to a draw. 1979, the backgammon program BKG by Hans Berliner defeats the world champion, the first computer program to defeat in an exhibition match a world champion in any game, though Berliner later attributes the win to luck with the dice rolls. 1992, backgammon program TD Gammon by Gary Tesaro reaches championship level ability using temporal difference learning, a form of reinforcement learning, and repeated plays against itself to improve. In the years since, backgammon programs have far surpassed the best human players. In both 81 and 82, Douglas Lennett's program Eurisco wins US Championship in Traveler TCS, a futuristic naval war game, prompting rule changes to block its unorthodox strategies. 97. The program Logistella wins every game in a 6-game match against world champion Takeshi Murakami. 97. Deep Blue beats the world chess champion Garry Kasparov. Kasparov claims to have seen glimpses of true intelligence and creativity in some of the computer's moves. Since then, chess engines have continued to improve. Yeah, this is probably the most popular one, is the chess one. The 97 Deep Blue beating Garry Kasparov. This is probably like the thing you're most familiar with. Anyways. Crosswords expert level, 1999. Crossword solving puzzle program Proverb outperforms the average crossword puzzle solver. In 2012, the program Dr. Phil, created by Matt Ginsberg, scores in the top quartile among the otherwise human contestants. Scrabble. As of 2002, Scrabble playing software surpasses the best human players. 2005, Bridge. Contract bridge playing software reaches parity with best human bridge players. Jeopardy! 2010. IBM's Watson defeats the 2 all-time greatest human Jeopardy champions, Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter. Poker. Computer poker players remain slightly below the best humans for full ring Texas Hold'em, but perform at a superhuman level in some poker variants. Free Cell, Superhuman. Heuristics evolved using genetic algorithms to produce a solver for the solitaire game Free Cell. Go. Very strong amateur level. As of 2012, Zen series of Go playing programs has reached rank 6 Dan in fast games, level of a very strong amateur player, using Monte Carlo tree search and machine learning techniques. Go playing programs have been improving at a rate of about 1 Dan per year in recent years. If this rate of improvement continues, they might beat the human world champion in about a decade. We can look this up now, but this is just as of 2012, which was 13 years ago, bear in mind. There is an important sense, however, in which chess-playing AI turned out to be a lesser triumph than many imagined it would be. It was once supposed, perhaps not unreasonably, that in order for a computer to play chess at grandmaster level, it would have to be endowed with a high degree of general intelligence. One might have thought, for example, that great chess playing requires being able to learn abstract concepts, think cleverly about strategy, compose flexible plans, make a wide range of ingenious logical deductions, maybe even model one's opponent's thinking. Not so. It turned out to be possible to build a perfectly fine chess engine around a special purpose algorithm. When implemented on the fast processors that became available towards the end of the 20th century, it produced very strong play. But an AI built like that is narrow. It plays chess, it can do no other. In other domains, solutions have turned out to be more complicated than initially expected, and progress slower. The computer scientist Donald Knuth was struck that AI has by now succeeded in doing essentially everything that requires thinking, but has failed to do most of what people and animals do without thinking. That somehow is much harder. Analyzing visual scenes, recognizing objects, or controlling a robot's behavior as it interacts with the natural environment has proved challenging. Nevertheless, a fair amount of progress has been made and continues to be made, aided by steady developments and improvements in hardware. Common sense and natural language understanding have also turned out to be difficult. It is now often thought that achieving a fully human-level performance on these tasks is an AI-complete problem, meaning that the difficulty of solving these problems is essentially equivalent to the difficulty of building generally human-level intelligent machines. In other words, if somebody were to succeed in creating an AI that could understand natural language as well as human adults, they would in all likelihood also either already have succeeded in creating an AI that could do everything else that human intelligence can do, or they would be a very short step from a general capacity. I know everyone's asleep right now. How many people are even in this stream? I don't think there are that many people in the stream, are there? Most of you guys are probably asleep. But if you're not, this is kind of freaking me out. This paragraph. Common sense and natural language understanding is was when at the time of writing, 2014, just about like 11 years ago. At the time of writing, they were like, natural language is probably the most difficult problem ever for AI, you know? It's an AI complete problem. By the time they figure this out, they'll probably have figured out general intelligence. Look at the state of ChatGPT right now today, and tell me that's not terrifying. I don't know. I find it scary, but I'm sure Nick Bostrom's got something to say about that, because he also has a book, doesn't he? Utopia, Life and Meaning is in a Solved World. That's his new book. He's got that going for him. Anyways. I think it's still somewhat not completely natural language. It is. It's natural language. That's what LLMs are doing, and they're really good at it. Obviously it's a little off right now. Like, you can go like, oh well, it's not perfect because they tend to glaze the user too much, you know, and to use the words of the youth, right? But think about it this way. We won't be saying that in a few months, let alone like a year, let alone in 10 years. It's gonna be a problem long stuck in the past. It's kind of like the whole AI hallucinates, like not AI, but like, you know, LLMs hallucinate too much problem that happened, you know, back in the initial boom, I want to say 2-3 years ago, which is kind of what stopped me from abusing it immediately for everything in my life, because I was gonna, and then it kept hallucinating stuff, and I thought, oh well, now I can't use it then, oh well. But now it's just getting a lot better. It's not completely eliminated the problem, but it's getting really close to the point where now it's like actually kind of reliable if you want to look up certain bits that, you know, provide a source for things. But doesn't natural language include tone, stuff like sarcasm and truth and lies? what we don't really think about is the hardest for the thinking machine. Yes, that echoes the point earlier, right? Like the subconscious stuff, or like the things we don't think about are harder for the machines than the stuff we do consciously think about a lot, right? Um, it's getting there. It's learning how to do that. Or maybe that's a dangerous way to put it, right? Because I don't want to say it's learning. It's not capable of learning anything, or rather, it is getting better at simulating capacity for that. Like you can go into the LLM and ask it to, respond to your queries in a different tone, or like be sarcastic or whatever, and it will replicate it perfectly. And because it doesn't know what that is, but you know what I'm saying. When I say like it knows or it's learning, that's not to say that I'm trying to humanize the thing. It's that what I mean is like the development of these large language models is inching closer and closer towards this, well, AI complete problem. Again, 2014. Anyways, chess playing expertise turned out to be achievable by means of surprisingly simple algorithm. It is tempting to speculate that other capabilities, such as general reasoning ability or some key ability involved in programming, might likewise be achievable through some surprisingly simple algorithm. The fact that the best performance at one time is attained through a complicated mechanism does not mean that no simple mechanism could do the job as well or better. It might simply be that nobody has yet found the simpler alternative. The Ptolemaic system, with the Earth in the center, orbited by the Sun, Moon, planets, and stars, isn't that the heliocentric, or am I mistaken? Maybe that's the new system, I forget. Anyways, represented the state-of-the-art in astronomy for over 1,000 years, and its predictive accuracy was improved over the centuries by progressively complicating the model, adding epicycles upon epicycles to the postulated celestial motions. Then the entire system was overthrown by the heliocentric theory of Copernicus. Oh yeah, sorry, heliocentrism is the new thing, which was simpler and, only after further elaboration by Kepler, more predictively accurate. Artificial intelligence methods are now used in more areas than it would make sense to review here, but mentioning a sampling of them will give an idea of the breadth of applications. Aside from the game AIs listed in Table 1, there are hearing aids with algorithms that filter out ambient noise, route finders that display maps and offer navigation advice to drivers, recommender systems that suggest books and music albums based on a user's previous purchases and ratings, and medical decisions support systems that help doctors diagnose breast cancer, recommend treatment plans, and aid in the interpretation of electrocardiograms. There are robotic pets and cleaning robots, lawn mowing robots, rescue robots, surgical robots, and over 1 million industrial robots. The world population of robots exceeds 10 million. Modern speech recognition, based on statistical techniques such as hidden Markov models, has become sufficiently accurate for practical use. Some fragments of this book were drafted with the help of a speech recognition program. Personal digital assistants, such as Apple's Siri, respond to spoken commands and can answer simple questions and execute commands. Optical character recognition of handwritten and typewritten text is routinely used in applications such as mail sorting and digitization of old documents. Machine translation remains imperfect, but is good enough for many applications. Early systems used the GeoFAI approach of hand-coded grammars that had to be developed by skilled linguists from the ground up for each language. Newer systems use statistical machine learning techniques that automatically build statistical models from observed usage patterns. The machine infers the parameters for these models by analyzing bilingual corpora. This approach dispenses with linguists. The programmers building these systems need not even speak the languages they are working with. Face recognition has improved sufficiently in recent years that it is now used at automated border crossings in Europe and Australia. The US Department of State operates a face recognition system with over 75 million photographs for visa processing. Surveillance systems employ increasingly sophisticated AI and data mining technologies to analyze voice, video, or text, large quantities of which are trawled from the world's electronic communications media and stored in giant data centers. Theorem proving and equation solving are by now so well established that they are hardly regarded as AI anymore. Equation solvers are included in scientific computing programs such as Mathematica. Formal verification methods, including automated theorem provers, are routinely used by chip manufacturers to verify the behavior of circuit designs prior to production. The US military and intelligence establishments have been leading the way to the large-scale deployment of bomb-disposing robots, surveillance and attack drones, and other unmanned machines. These still depend mainly on remote control by human operators, but work is underway to extend their autonomous capabilities. And just a quick insert here again. This was all written in 2014. It feels dated, doesn't it? This guy is talking about, oh, the future of AI and how impressive like modern AI is now. But him writing it in 2014, like, it's outdated. Oof. Surveillance systems are increasingly using AI? No, they all use AI, and they're all really good at scraping all of our data and selling it to the highest bidder. And then tailoring our ads based on what we say to the phones we have that constantly monitor everything we say. Like, shit is generated for everything now. Art, text, papers, academic journal papers, you know, like all of that. Intelligent scheduling is a major area of success. The DART tool for automated logistics planning and scheduling was used in Operation Desert Storm in 1991 to such effect that DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the United States, claims that this single application more than paid back their 30-year investment in AI. Airline and reservation systems use sophisticated scheduling and pricing systems. Businesses make wide use of AI techniques in inventory and control systems. They also use automatic telephone reservation systems and helplines connected to speech recognition software to usher their hapless customers through labyrinths of interlocking menu options. AI technologies underline many internet services. Software polices the world's email traffic, and despite continual adaptation by spammers to circumvent the countermeasures being brought against them, Bayesian spam filters have largely managed to hold the spam tide at bay. Oh, not much. Nowadays, software using AI components is responsible for automatically approving or declining credit card transactions and continuously monitors account activity for signs of fraudulent use. Information retrieval systems also make extensive use of machine learning. The Google search engine is arguably the greatest AI system that has yet been built. Now, it must be stressed that the demarcation between artificial intelligence and software in general is not sharp. Some of the applications listed above may be viewed more as generic software rather than AI, though this brings us back to McCarthy's dictum that when something works, it is no longer called AI. A more relevant distinction for our purposes is that between systems that have a narrow range of cognitive capability, whether that be called AI or not, and systems that have more generally applicable problem-solving capabilities. Essentially, all the systems currently in use are of the former type, narrow. However, many of them contain components that might also play a role in future artificial general intelligence or be of service in its development. Components such as classifiers, search algorithms, planners, solvers, and representational frameworks. One high-stakes and extremely competitive environment in which AI systems operate today is the global financial market. Automated stock trading systems are widely used by major investing houses. While some of these are simply ways of automating the execution of particular buy or sell orders issued by a human fund manager, others pursue complicated trading strategies that adapt to changing market conditions. Analytic systems use an assortment of data mining techniques and time series analyses to scan for patterns and trends in securities markets or to correlate historical price movements with external variables such as keywords and news tickers. Financial news providers sell news feeds that are specially formatted for use by such AI programs. Other systems specialize in finding arbitrage opportunities within or between markets, or in high-frequency trading that seeks to profit from minute price movements that occur over the course of milliseconds, a timescale at which communication latencies, even for the speed of light signals and optical fiber cable, become significant, making it advantageous to locate computers near the exchange. Algorithmic high-frequency traders account for more than half of the equity shares traded on US markets. Algorithmic trading has been implemented in the 2010 flash crash. Box 2. The 2010 flash crash. By the afternoon of May 6, 2010, US equity markets were already down 4% on worries about the European debt crisis. 2:32 p.m., a large seller, a mutual fund complex, initiated a sell algorithm to dispose of a large number of the E-mini S&P 500 futures contracts to be sold off at a sell rate linked to a measure of minute-to-minute liquidity on the exchange. These contracts were bought by algorithmic high-frequency traders, which were programmed to quickly eliminate the temporary long positions by selling the contracts on to other traders. With demand from fundamental buyers slacking, the algorithmic traders started to sell the E-minis primarily to other algorithmic traders, which in turn passed them on to other algorithmic traders, creating a hot potato effect driving up trading volume. This being interpreted by the sell algorithm as an indicator of high liquidity, prompting it to increase the rate at which it was putting E-mini contracts in the market, pushing the downward spiral. At some point, the high-frequency traders started withdrawing from the market, drying up liquidity while prices continued to fall. At 2:45 p.m., trading on the E-mini was halted by an automatic circuit breaker, the exchange's stop logic functionality. When trading was restarted, a mere 5 seconds later, prices stabilized and soon began to recover most of the losses. But for a while, at the trough of the crisis, $1 trillion had been wiped off the market, and spillover effects had led to a substantial number of trades in individual securities being executed at absurd prices, such as 1 cent or $100,000. After the market closed for the day, representatives of the exchanges met with regulators and decided to break all trades that had been executed at prices 60% or more away from their pre-crisis levels, deeming such transactions clearly erroneous and thus subject to post-facto cancellation under existing trade rules. The retelling here of this episode is a digression because the computer programs involved in the flash crash were not particularly intelligent or sophisticated, and the kind of threat they created is fundamentally different from the concerns we shall raise later in this book in relation to the prospect of machine superintelligence. Nevertheless, these events illustrate several useful lessons. One is the reminder that interactions between individually simple components, such as the cell algorithm and the high-frequency algorithmic trading programs, can produce complicated and unexpected effects. Systemic risk can build up in a system as new elements are introduced. Risks that are not obvious until after something goes wrong, and sometimes not even then. Another lesson is that smart professionals might give an instruction to a program based on a sensible seeming and normally sound assumption, e.g. that trading volume is a good measure of market liquidity, and that this can produce catastrophic results when the program continues to act on the instruction with ironclad logical consistency, even in the unanticipated situation where the assumption turns out to be invalid. The algorithm just does what it does, and unless it is a very special kind of algorithm, it does not care that we clasp our heads and gasp in dumbstruck horror at the absurd inappropriateness of its actions. This is a theme that we will encounter again. A third observation in relation to the flash crash is that while automation contributed to the incident, it also contributed to its resolution. The pre-programmed stop order logic, which suspended trading when prices moved too far out of whack, was set to execute automatically because it had been correctly anticipated that the triggering events could happen on a timescale too swift for humans to respond. The need for pre-installed and automatically executing safety functionality, as opposed to a reliance on runtime human supervision, again foreshadows a theme that will be important in our discussion of machine superintelligence. Opinions about the future of machine intelligence. Progress on two major fronts towards a more solid statistical and information theoretic foundation for machine learning on the one hand, and towards the practical and commercial success of various problem-specific or domain-specific applications on the other, has restored to AI research some of its lost prestige. There may, however, be a residual cultural effect on the AI community of its earlier history that makes many mainstream researchers reluctant to align themselves with overgrand ambition. Thus, Niels Nilsson, one of the old-timers in the field, complains that his present-day colleagues lack the boldness of spirit that propelled the pioneers of his own generation. Concern for respectability has had, I think, a stultifying effect on some AI researchers. I hear them saying things like, AI used to be criticized for its flossiness. Now that we have made solid progress, let us not risk losing our respectability. One result of this conservatism has been increased concentration on weak AI, the variety devoted to providing aids to human thought, and away from strong AI, the variety that attempts to mechanize human-level intelligence. Nielsen's sentiment has been echoed by several others of the founders, including Marvin Minsky, John McCarthy, and Patrick Winson. The last few years have seen a resurgence of interest in AI, which might yet spill onto renewed efforts towards artificial general intelligence, what Nielsen calls strong AI. In addition to faster hardware, a contemporary project would benefit from the great strides that have been made in the many subfields of AI, in software engineering more generally, and in neighboring fields such as computational neuroscience. One indication of pent-up demand for quality information and education is shown in the response to the free online offering of an introductory course in artificial intelligence at Stanford University in the fall of 2011, organized by Sebastian Thrun and Peter Norvig. Some 160,000 students from around the world signed up to take it, and 23,000 completed it. Expert opinions about the future of AI vary wildly. There is disagreement about timescales as well as what forms AI might eventually take. Predictions about the future development of artificial intelligence, one recent study noted, are as confident as they are diverse. Although the contemporary distribution of belief has not yet been very carefully measured, we can get a rough impression from various smaller surveys and informal observations. In particular, a series of recent surveys have polled members of several relevant expert communities on the question of when they expect human-level machine intelligence to be developed, defined as one that can carry out most human professions at least as well as a typical human. Again, this is 2014 we're reading, and 2025 right now, I think that's already the case. It's weird, but I think we're already here. Results are shown in table 2. The combined sample gave the following median estimate: 10% probability of HLMI by 2022, 50% by 2040, and 90% by 2075. Respondents were asked to pre-miss their estimates on the assumption that human scientific activity continues without major negative disruption. These numbers should be taken with some grain of salt. Sample sizes are quite small and not necessarily representative of the general expert population. They are, however, in concordance with results from other surveys. The survey results are also in line with some recently published interviews with about 24 researchers in AI-related fields. For example, Niels Nielsen has spent a long and productive career working on problems in searching, planning, knowledge representation, or robotics. He has authored textbooks in artificial intelligence, and he recently completed the most comprehensive history of the field written to date. When asked about arrival dates for HLMI, he offered the following opinion: 10% chance 2030, 50% chance 2050, 90% chance 2100. 10% chance for 2030, huh? Well, looks like we're ahead of schedule, I think. I think we're a little ahead of schedule. Anyways, judging from the published interview transcripts, Professor Nielsen's probability distribution appears to be quite representative of many experts in the area, though again it must be emphasized that there is a widespread of opinion. There are practitioners who are substantially more boosterish, confidently expecting HLMI in the 2020 to 2040 range, and others who are confident either that it will never happen or it is indefinitely far off. In addition, some interviewees felt that the notion of a human level of AI is ill-defined or misleading, or are for other reasons reluctant to go on record with a quantitative prediction. My own view is that the median numbers reported in the expert survey do not have enough probability mass on later arrival dates. A 10% probability of HLMI not having been developed by 2075 or even 2100 after conditionalizing on human scientific activity continuing without major negative disruption seems too low. Historically, AI researchers have not had a strong record of being able to predict the rate of advances in their own field or the shape of that such advances would take. On the one hand, some tasks like chess playing turn out to be achievable by means of surprisingly simple programs, and naysayers who claim that machines would never be able to do this or that have repeatedly been proven wrong. On the other hand, the more typical errors among practitioners have been to underestimate the difficulties of getting a system to perform robustly on real-world tasks, and to overestimate the advantages of their own particular pet project or technique. The survey also asked 2 other questions of relevance to our inquiry. One inquired of respondents about how much longer they thought it would take to reach superintelligence, assuming human-level machine is first achieved. Results are in Table 3. Another question inquired what they thought would be the overall long-term impact for humanity of achieving human-level intelligence. The answers are summarized in Figure 2. My own views again differ somewhat from the opinions expressed in the survey. I assign a higher probability to superintelligence being created relatively soon after human-level machine intelligence. I also have a more polarized outlook on the consequences, thinking an extremely good or an extremely bad outcome to be somewhat more likely than a more balanced outcome. I think I agree with this guy. The reasons for this will become clear later in the book. How long from human level to superintelligence? Small sample sizes, selection biases, and above all, the inherent unreliability of the subjective opinions elicited mean that one should not read too much into these expert surveys and interviews. They do not let us draw any strong conclusion, but they do hint at a weak conclusion. They suggest that, at least, in lieu of better data analysis, it may be reasonable to believe that human-level machine intelligence has a fairly sizable chance of being developed by mid-century, and that it has a non-trivial chance of being developed considerably sooner or much later. That it might perhaps fairly soon thereafter result in superintelligence, and that a wide range of outcomes may have a significant chance of occurring, including extremely good outcomes and outcomes that are as bad as human extinction. At the very least, they suggest that the topic is worth a closer look. Okay. That was chapter 1, but I'm wondering if I should keep going now. It's like about 30 more pages. Go for it if you feel like it. Yeah, I'm trying to see if I feel like it. I don't think I do. The problem is there's 15 chapters in this book, and there's a lot of chapters. I don't know if I'll do 15 streams. So, it won't be very long if you read another. It would kind of, because like reading is a lot more. Reading out loud is quite difficult for me. In the sense that I'm a lot better at just like talking for hours, but like reading for hours is like reading out loud. I mean, like reading silently, yeah, I could do, but like reading out loud is a little difficult. Okay. Yeah, sure, I'll do another chapter. Okay. I'll do chapter 2. I'll do chapter 2 as well. I'm gonna get some water though. I will get some water though. So I'll be right back. Alright, where were we? Alright, guess we're doing chapter 2 as well. Chapter 2. Paths to Superintelligence. Machines are currently far inferior to humans in general intelligence, yet one day we have suggested they will be super intelligent. How do we get from here to there? This chapter explores several conceivable technological paths. We look at artificial intelligence, whole brain emulation, biological cognition, and human-machine interfaces, as well as networks and organizations. We evaluate their different degrees of plausibility as pathways to superintelligence. The existence of multiple paths increases the probability that the destination can be reached via at least one of them. Now, we can tentatively define a superintelligence as any intellect that greatly exceeds the cognitive performances of humans in virtually all domains of interest. We'll have more to say about the concept of superintelligence in the next chapter, where we will subject it to a kind of spectral analysis to distinguish some different possible forms of superintelligence. But for now, the rough characterization just given will suffice. Note that the definition is non-committal about how the superintelligence is implemented. It is also non-committal regarding qualia, whether a superintelligence would have subjective conscious experience might matter greatly for some questions, in particular for some moral questions, but our primary focus here is on the causal antecedents and consequences of superintelligence, not on the metaphysics of mind. The chess program Deep Fritz is not a superintelligence on this definition, since Fritz is only smart within the narrow domain of chess. Certain kinds of domain-specific superintelligence could, however, be important. When referring to superintelligent performance limited to a particular domain, we will note the restriction explicitly. For instance, an engineering superintelligence would be an intellect that vastly outperforms the best current human minds in the domain of engineering. Unless otherwise noted, we use the term to refer to systems that have a superhuman level of general intelligence. But how might we create superintelligence? Let us examine some possible paths. Artificial intelligence. Readers of this chapter must not expect a blueprint for programming an AI and artificial general intelligence and AGI. No such blueprint exists yet, of course, and had I been in possession of such a blueprint, I most certainly would not have published it in a book. If the reasons for this are not immediately obvious, the arguments in subsequent chapters will make them clear. We can, however, discern some general features of the kind of system that would be required. It now seems clear that a capacity to learn would be an integral feature of the core design of a system intended to attain general intelligence, not something to be tacked on later as an extension or an afterthought. The same holds for the ability to deal effectively with uncertainty and probabilistic information. Some faculty for extracting useful concepts from sensory data and internal states, and for leveraging acquired concepts into flexible combinatorial representations for use in logical and intuitive reasoning. Also likely belong among the core design features in a modern AI intended to attain general intelligence. The early good old-fashioned artificial intelligence systems did not for the most part focus on learning, uncertainty, or concept formation, perhaps because techniques for dealing with these dimensions were poorly developed at the time. This is not to say that the underlying ideas are all that novel. The idea of using learning as a means of bootstrapping a simpler system to human-level intelligence can be traced back at least to Alan Turing's notion of a child machine, which he wrote about in 1950. Instead of trying to produce a program to simulate the adult mind, why not rather try to produce one which simulates the child's? If this were then subjected to an appropriate course of education, one would obtain the adult brain. Turing envisaged an iterative process to develop such a child machine. We cannot expect to find a good child machine at the first attempt. One must experiment with teaching one such machine and see how well it learns. One can then try another and see if it is better or worse. There is an obvious connection between this process and evolution. One may hope, however, that this process will be more expeditious than evolution. The survival of the fittest is a slow method for measuring advantages. The experimenter, by the exercise of intelligence, should be able to speed it up. Equally important is the fact that he is not restricted to random mutations. If he can trace a cause for some weakness, he can probably think of the kind of mutation which will improve it. We know that blind evolutionary processes can produce human-level general intelligence, since they have already done so at least once. Evolutionary processes with foresight, that is, genetic programs designed and guided by an intelligent human programmer, should be able to achieve a similar outcome with far greater efficiency. This observation has been used by some philosophers and scientists, including David Chalmers and Hans Moravec, to argue that human-level AI is not only theoretically possible, but feasible within this century. The idea is that we can estimate the relative capabilities of evolution and human engineering to produce intelligence, and find that human engineering is already vastly superior to evolution in some areas and is likely to become superior in the remaining areas before too long. The fact that evolution produced intelligence, therefore, indicates that human engineering will soon be able to do the same. Thus, Moravec wrote, already back in 1976, the existence of several examples of intelligence designed under these constraints should give us great confidence that we can achieve the same in short order. The situation is analogous to the history of heavier-than-air flight, where birds, bats, and insects clearly demonstrated the possibility before our culture masters. One needs to be cautious, though, in what inferences one draws from this line of reasoning. It is true that evolution produced heavier-than-air flight, and that human engineers subsequently succeeded in doing likewise, albeit by means of a very different mechanism. Other examples could also be adduced, such as sonar, magnetic navigation, chemical weapons, photoreceptors, and all kinds of mechanic and kinetic performance characteristics. However, one could equally point to areas where human engineers have thus far failed to match evolution. In morphogenesis, self-repair, and the immune defense, for example, human efforts lagged far behind what nature has accomplished. Moravec's argument, therefore, cannot give us great confidence that we can achieve human-level artificial intelligence in short order. At best, the evolution of intelligent life places an upper bound on the intrinsic difficulty of designing intelligence, but this upper bound could be quite far above current human engineering capabilities. Another way of deploying an evolutionary argument for the feasibility of AI is via the idea that we could, by running genetic algorithms on sufficiently fast computers, achieve results comparable to those of biological evolution. This version of the evolutionary argument thus proposes a specific method whereby intelligence could be produced. But is it true that we will soon have computing power sufficient to recapitulate the relevant evolutionary processes that produced human intelligence? The answer depends both on how much computing technology will advance over the next decades, and on how much computing power would be required to run genetic algorithms with the same optimization power as the evolutionary process of natural selection that lies in our past. Although in the end, the conclusion we get from pursuing this line of reasoning is disappointingly indeterminate, it is instructive to attempt a rough estimate. See box 3. If nothing else, the exercise draws attention to some interesting unknowns. The upshot is that the computational resources required to simply replicate the relevant evolutionary processes on Earth that produced human-level intelligence are severely out of reach, and will remain so even if Moore's law were to continue for a century. It is plausible, however, that compared with brute force replication of natural evolutionary processes, vast efficiency gains are achievable by designing the search process to aim for intelligence, using various obvious improvements over natural selection. Yet it is very hard to bound the magnitude of those attainable efficiency gains. We cannot even say whether they amount to 5 or to 25 orders of magnitude. Absent further elaboration, therefore, evolutionary arguments are not able to meaningfully constrain our expectations of either the difficulty of building human-level machine intelligence or the timescales for such developments. Box 3. What would it take to recapitulate revolution? Not every feat accomplished by evolution in the course of the development of human intelligence is relevant to a human engineer trying to artificially evolve machine intelligence. Only a small portion of evolutionary selection on Earth has been selection for intelligence. More specifically, the problems that human engineers cannot trivially bypass may have been the target of a very small portion of total evolutionary selection. For example, since we can run our computers on electrical power, we do not have to reinvent the molecules of the cellular energy economy in order to create intelligent machines. Yet such molecular evolution of metabolic pathways might have used up a large part of the total amount of selection power that was available to evolution over the course of Earth's history. One might argue that the key insights for AI are embodied in the structure of nervous systems, which came into existence less than a billion years ago. If we take that view, then the number of relevant experiments available to evolution is drastically curtailed. There are some 4 to 6 times 10 to the power of 30 prokaryotes in the world today, but only 10 to the power 19 insects and fewer than 10 to the power 10 humans, while pre-agricultural populations were orders of magnitude smaller. These numbers are only moderately intimidating. Evolutionary algorithms, however, require not only variations to select among, but also a fitness function to evaluate variance, and this is typically the most computationally expensive component. A fitness function for the evolution of artificial intelligence plausibly requires simulation of neural development, learning, and cognition to evaluate fitness. We might thus do better not to look at the raw number of organisms with complex nervous systems, but instead to attend to the number of neurons in biological organisms that we might need to mimic evolution's finest fitness function. We can make a crude estimate of that latter quantity by considering insects, which dominate terrestrial animal biomass, with ants alone estimated to contribute some 15 to 20%. Insect brain sizes vary substantially, with large and social insects sporting larger brains. A honeybee brain has just under 10 to the power 6 neurons. Fruit fly brain, 10 to the power 5. Fruit fly brain, 10 to the power 5, and ants are in between with 250,000. The majority of smaller insects may have brains of only a few thousand neurons, erring on the side of conservatively high. If we assigned all 10 to the power of 19 insects fruit fly numbers of neurons, the total would be 10 to the power of 24 insect neurons in the world. That's some interesting napkin math here. This could be augmented with an additional order of magnitude to account for aquatic copepods, birds, reptiles, mammals, etc., to reach 10 to the power 25. By contrast, in pre-agricultural times, there were fewer than 10 to the 7 humans, with under 10 to the power of 11 neurons each, thus fewer than 10 to the power of 18 human neurons in total, although humans have a higher number of synapses per neuron. The computational cost of simulating one neuron depends on the level of detail that one includes in the simulation. Extremely simple neuron models use about 1,000 floating point operations per second, flops, to simulate one neuron in real time. The electrophysiologically realistic Hodgkin-Huxley model uses 0.2 million flops. A more detailed multi-compartmental model would add another 3 to 4 orders of magnitude. Higher level models that abstract systems of neurons could subtract 2 to 3 orders of magnitude from the simple models. If we were to simulate 10 to the power 25 neurons over a billion years of evolution, longer than the existence of nervous systems as we know them, and we allow our computers to run for 1 year, these figures would give us a requirement for the range of 10 to 31 to 10 to the power 44 flops. For comparison, China's Tianhe 2, the world's most powerful supercomputer as of September 2013, provides only 3.39 times 10 to the power 16 flops. In recent decades, it has taken approximately 6.7 years for commodity computers to increase in power by 1 order of magnitude. Even a century of continued Moore's law would not be enough to close this gap. Running more specialized hardware or allowing longer runtimes could contribute only a few more orders of magnitude. This figure is conservative in another respect. Evolution achieved human intelligence without aiming at this outcome. In other words, the fitness functions for natural organisms do not select only for astute intelligence and its precursors. Even environments in which organisms with superior information processing skills reap various rewards may not select for intelligence, because improvements to intelligence can, and often do, impose significant costs, such as higher energy consumption or slower maturation times, and those costs may outweigh whatever benefits are gained from smarter behavior. Excessively deadly environments also reduce the value of intelligence. The shorter one's expected lifespan, the less time there will be for increased learning ability to pay off. Reduced selective pressure for intelligence slows the spread of intelligence-enhancing innovations, and thus the opportunity for selection to favor subsequent innovations that depend on them. Furthermore, evolution may wind up stuck in local optima that humans would notice and bypass by altering trade-offs, routine exploitation, and exploration, or by providing a smooth progression of increasingly difficult intelligence tests. And as mentioned earlier, evolution scatters much of its selection power on traits that are unrelated to intelligence, such as Red Queen's races of competitive coevolution between immune systems and parasites. Evolution continues to waste resources producing mutations that have proved consistently lethal, and it fails to take advantage of statistical similarities in the effects of different mutations. These are all inefficiencies in natural selection, when viewed as a means of evolving intelligence, that it would be relatively easy for a human engineer to avoid while using evolutionary algorithms to develop intelligent software. It is plausible that eliminating inefficiencies like those just described would trim many orders of magnitude off the 10 to 31 to 10 to 44 flops range calculated earlier. Unfortunately, it is difficult to know how many orders of magnitude. It is difficult even to make a rough estimate. For all we know, the efficiency savings could be 5 orders of magnitude, or 10, or 25. Figure 3. Supercomputer performance. In a narrow sense, Moore's law refers to the observation that the number of transistors on integrated circuits have for several decades doubled approximately every 2 years. However, the term is often used to refer to the more general observation that many performance metrics in computing technology have followed a similarly fast exponential trend. Here we plot peak speed of the world's fastest supercomputer as a function on time, on a logarithmic vertical scale. In recent years, growth in the serial speed of processors has stagnated, but increased use of parallelization has enabled the total number of computations performed to remain on the trend line. There is a further complication with these kinds of evolutionary considerations, one that makes it hard to derive from them even a very loose upper bound on the difficulty of evolving intelligence. We must avoid the error of inferring from the fact that intelligent life evolved on Earth that the evolutionary processes involved had a reasonably high prior probability of producing intelligence. Such an inference is unsound because it fails to take account of the observation selection effect that guarantees that all observers will find themselves having originated on a planet where intelligent life arose, no matter how likely or unlikely it was for any given such planet to produce intelligence. Suppose, for example, that in addition to the systematic effects of natural selection, it required an enormous amount of lucky coincidence to produce intelligent life, enough so that intelligent life evolves on only one planet out of every 10 to the power of 30 planets on which simple replicators arise. In that case, when we run our genetic algorithms to try to replicate what natural evolution did, we might find that we must run some 10 to the power of 30 simulations before we find one where all the elements come together just in the right way. This seems fully consistent with our observation that life did evolve here on Earth. Only by careful and somewhat intricate reasoning, by analyzing instances of convergent evolution of intelligence-related traits and engaging with the subtleties of observation selection theory, can we partially circumvent this epistemological barrier. Unless one takes the trouble to do so, one is not in a position to rule out the possibility that the alleged upper bound of the computational requirements for recapitulating the evolution of intelligence derived in Box 3 might be too low by 30 orders of magnitude, or some other such large number. Another way of arguing for the feasibility of artificial intelligence is by pointing to the human brain and suggesting that we could use it as a template for a machine intelligence. One can distinguish different versions of this approach based on how closely they propose to imitate biological brain functions. At one extreme, that of very close imitation, we have the idea of whole brain emulation, which we will discuss in the next subsection. At the other extreme are approaches that take their inspiration from the functioning of the brain, but do not attempt low-level imitation. Advances in neuroscience and cognitive psychology, which will be aided by improvements in instrumentation, should eventually uncover the general principles of brain function. This knowledge could then guide AI efforts. We have already encountered neural networks as an example of a brain-inspired AI technique. Hierarchical perceptual organization is another idea that has been transferred from brain science to machine learning. The study of reinforcement learning has been motivated, at least in part, by its role in psychological theories of animal cognition. And reinforcement learning techniques, e.g. the TD algorithm, inspired by these theories, are now widely used in AI. More cases like these will surely accumulate in the future. Since there is a limited number, perhaps a very small number, of distinct fundamental mechanisms that operate in the brain, continuing incremental progress in the brain science should eventually discover them all. Before this happens, though, it is possible that a hybrid approach, combining some brain-inspired technique with some purely artificial methods, would cross the finishing line. In that case, the resultant system needs not to be recognizably brain-like, even though some brain-derived insights were used in its development. The availability of the brain as a template provides stronger support for the claim that machine intelligence is ultimately feasible. This, however, does not enable us to predict when it will be achieved because it is so hard to predict the future rate of discoveries in brain science. What we can say is that the further into the future we look, the greater the likelihood that the secrets of the brain's functionality will have been decoded sufficiently to enable the creation of machine intelligence in this manner. Different people working toward machine intelligence hold different views about how promising neuromorphic approaches are compared with approaches that aim for completely synthetic designs. The existence of birds demonstrated that heavier-than-air flight was physically possible and prompted efforts to build flying machines. Yet, the first functioning airplanes did not flap their wings. The jury is out on whether machine intelligence will be like flight, which humans achieved through an artificial mechanism, or like combustion, which we initially mastered by copying naturally occurring fires. Turing's idea of designing a program that acquires most of its content by learning, rather than having it pre-programmed at the outset, can apply equally to neuromorphic and synthetic approaches to machine intelligence. A variation on Turing's conception of a child machine is the idea of a seed AI, whereas a child machine, as Turing seems to have envisaged it, would have a relatively fixed architecture that simply develops its inherent potentialities by accumulating content. A seed AI would be more sophisticated artificial intelligence capable of improving its own architecture. In the early stages of a seed AI, such improvements might occur mainly through trial and error, information acquisition, or assistance from the programmers. At its later stages, a seed AI should be able to understand its own working sufficiently to engineer new algorithms and computational structures to bootstrap its cognitive performance. This needed understanding could result from the seed AI reaching a sufficient level of general intelligence across many domains, or from crossing some threshold in a particularly relevant domain such as computer science or mathematics. This brings us to another important concept, that of recursive self-improvement. A successful seed AI would be able to iteratively enhance itself. An early version of the AI could design an improved version of itself, and the improved version, being smarter than the original, might be able to design an even smarter version of itself, and so forth. Under some conditions, such a process of recursive self-improvement might continue long enough to result in an intelligence explosion, an event in which, in a short period of time, a system's level of intelligence increases from a relatively modest endowment of cognitive capabilities, perhaps subhuman in most respects, but with a domain-specific talent for coding and AI research, to radical superintelligence. We will return to this important possibility in Chapter 4, where the dynamics of such an event will be analyzed more closely. Note that this model suggests the possibility of surprises. Attempts to build artificial general intelligence might fail pretty much completely until the last missing critical component is put in place, at which point a seed AI might become capable of sustained recursive self-improvement. Before we end this subsection, there is one more thing that we should emphasize, which is that an artificial intelligence need not much resemble a human mind. AIs could be, indeed, it is likely that most will be, extremely alien. We should expect that they will have very different cognitive architectures than biological intelligences, and in their early stages of development, they'll have very different profiles of cognitive strengths and weaknesses, though, as we shall later argue, they could eventually overcome any initial weakness. Furthermore, the goal systems of AIs could diverge radically from those of human beings. There is no reason to expect a generic AI to be motivated by love or hate or pride or other such common human sentiments. These complex adaptations will require deliberate, expensive effort to recreate in AIs. This is at once a big problem and a big opportunity. We will return to the issue of AI motivation in later chapters, but it is so central to the argument in this book that it is worth bearing in mind throughout. Whole brain emulation. In whole brain emulation, also known as uploading, intelligent software would be produced by scanning and closely modeling the computational structure of a biological brain. This approach thus represents a limiting case of drawing inspiration from nature, barefaced plagiarism. Achieving whole brain emulation requires the accomplishment of the following steps. First, a sufficiently detailed scan of a particular human brain is created. This might involve stabilizing the brain post-mortem through vitrification, a process that turns tissue into a kind of glass. A machine could then dissect the tissue into thin slices, which could be fed into another machine for scanning, perhaps by an array of electron microscopes. Various stains might be applied at this stage to bring out different structural and chemical properties. Many scanning machines could work in parallel to process multiple brain slices simultaneously. Excuse me, that was my chair, sorry. And yes, it's the brain downloading thing, or the brain uploading thing is what this is. Second, the raw data from those scanners is fed to a computer for automated image processing to reconstruct the three-dimensional neuronal network that implemented cognition in the original brain. In practice, this step might proceed concurrently with the first step to reduce the amount of high-resolution image data stored in buffers. The resulting map is then combined with a library of neurocomputational models of different types of neurons or of different neuronal elements, such as particular kinds of synaptic connectors. Figure 4 shows some results of scanning and image processing produced with present-day technology. In the third stage, the neurocomputational structure resulting from the previous step is implemented on a sufficiently powerful computer. If completely successful, the results would be a digital reproduction of the original intellect, with memory and personality intact. The emulated human mind now exists as software on a computer. The mind can either inhabit a virtual reality or interface with the external world by means of robotic appendages. The whole brain emulation path does not require that we figure out how human cognition works or how to program an artificial intelligence. It requires only that we understand the low-level functional characteristics of the basic computational elements of the brain. No fundamental conceptual or theoretical breakthrough is needed for the whole brain emulation to succeed. Whole brain emulation does, however, require some rather advanced enabling technologies. There are 3 key prerequisites. Scanning. 1. High-throughput microscopy with sufficient resolution and detection of relevant properties. 2. Translation, automated image analysis to turn raw scanning data into an interpreted 3-dimensional model of relevant neurocomputational elements. And 3. Simulation, hardware powerful enough to implement the results in computational structure. See Table 4. In comparison with these more challenging steps, the construction of a basic virtual reality or robotic embodiment with an audio-visual input channel and some simple output channel is relatively easy. Simple, yet minimally adequate I/O seems feasible already with present technology. Figure 4, reconstructing 3D neuroanatomy from electron microscope images. Upper left is a typical electron micrograph showing cross-sections of neural matter, dendrites, and axons. Upper right, volume image of rabbit retinal neural tissue required by serial block phase scanning electron microscopy. Individual 2D images have been stacked into a cube with a side approximately of 11 ampere, I think. No, that's not ampere. I don't know what that unit is. I'm sorry. Bottom is a reconstruction of a subset of the neuronal projections filling a volume of neuropil, generated by an automated segmentation algorithm. There is good reason to think that the requisite enabling technologies are attainable, though not in the near future. Reasonable computational models of many types of neuron and neuronal processes already exist. Image recognition software has been developed that can trace axons and dendrites through a stack of 2-dimensional images, though reliability needs to be improved. And there are imaging tools that provide the necessary resolution. With a scanning tunneling microscope, it is possible to see individual atoms, which is a far higher resolution than needed. However, although present knowledge and capabilities suggest that there is no in-principle barrier to the development of the requisite enabling technologies, it is clear that a very great deal of incremental technical progress, would be needed to bring human whole brain emulation within reach. For example, microscopy technology would need not just sufficient resolution, but also sufficient throughput. Using an atomic resolution scanning tunneling microscope to image the needed surface area would be far too slow to be practical. It would be more plausible to use a lower resolution electron microscope, but this would require new methods for preparing and staining cortical tissue to make visible relevant details such as synaptic fine structure. A great expansion of neurocomputational libraries and major improvements in automated image processing and scan interpretation would also be needed. So this is like the capabilities needed for the whole brain emulation: the scanning, translation, simulation. In general, whole brain emulation relies less on theoretical insight and more on technological capability than artificial intelligence. Just how much technology is required for the whole brain emulation depends on the level of abstraction at which the brain is emulated. In this regard, there is a trade-off between insight and technology. In general, the worse our scanning equipment and feebler our computers, the less we can rely on simulating low-level chemical and electrophysiological brain processes, and the more theoretical understanding would be needed of the computational architecture that we are seeking to emulate in order to create more abstract representations of the relevant functionalities. Conversely, with sufficiently advanced scanning technology and abundant computing power, it might be possible to brute force an emulation even with a fairly limited understanding of the brain. In the unrealistic limiting case, we could imagine emulating a brain at the level of its elementary particles using the quantum mechanical Schrödinger equation. Then one could rely entirely on existing knowledge of physics and not at all on any biological model. This extreme case, however, would place utterly impractical demands on computational power and data acquisition. A far more plausible level of emulation would be one that incorporates the individual neurons in their connectivity matrix, along with some of the structures of their dendritic trees and maybe some state variables of individual synapses. Neurotransmitter molecules would not be simulated individually, but their fluctuating concentrations would be modeled in a coarse-grained manner. To assess the feasibility of whole brain emulation, one must understand the criterion for success. The aim is not to create a brain simulation so detailed and accurate that one could use it to predict exactly what would have happened in the original brain if it had been subjected to a particular sequence of stimuli. Instead, the aim is to capture enough of the computationally functional properties of the brain to enable the resultant emulation to perform intellectual work. For this purpose, much of the messy biological detail of a real brain is irrelevant. A more elaborate analysis would distinguish between different levels of emulation success based on the extent to which the information processing functionality of the emulated brain has been preserved. For example, one could distinguish among 1. A high-fidelity emulation that has the full set of knowledge, skills, capacities, and values of the emulated brain. 2. A distorted emulation whose dispositions are significantly non-human in some ways, but which is mostly able to do the same intellectual labor as the emulated brain. And 3. A generic emulation, which might also be distorted. That is somewhat like an infant, lacking the skills or memories that have been acquired by the emulated adult brain, but with the capacity to learn most of what a normal human brain can learn. While it appears ultimately feasible to produce a high-fidelity emulation, it seems quite likely that the first whole-brain emulation that we would achieve if we want to work down this path would be of a lower grade. Before we would get things to work perfectly, we would probably get things to work imperfectly. It is also possible that a push towards emulation technology would lead to the creation of some kind of neuromorphic AI that would adapt some neurocomputational principles discovered during emulation efforts and hybridize them with synthetic methods, and that this would happen before the completion of a fully functional whole brain emulation. The possibility of such a spillover into neuromorphic AI, as we shall see in a later chapter, complicates the strategic assessment of the desirability of seeking to expedite emulation technology. How far are we currently from achieving a whole brain human evolution, a human whole brain emulation? One recent assessment presented a technical roadmap and concluded that the prerequisite capabilities might be available around mid-century, though with a large uncertainty interval. Figure 5 depicts the major milestones in this roadmap. The apparent simplicity of the map may be deceptive, however, and we should be careful not to underestimate how much work remains to be done. No brain has yet been emulated. Consider the humble model organism Caenorhabitatus elegans, which is a transparent roundworm, about 1 mm in length with 302 neurons. The complete connectivity matrix of those neurons has been known since the mid-1980s, when it was laboriously mapped out by means of slicing, electron microscopy, and hand labeling of specimens. But knowing merely which neurons are connected with which is not enough. To create a brain emulation, one would also need to know which synapses are excitatory and which are inhibitory, the strength of the connections, and various dynamical properties of axons, synapses, and dendritic trees. This information is not yet available even for the small nervous system of C. elegans, although it may now be within range of a targeted moderately sized research project. Success at emulating a tiny brain such as that of C. elegans would give us a better view of what it would take to emulate larger brains. At some point in the technology development process, once techniques are available for automatically emulating small quantities of brain tissue, the problem reduces to one of scaling. Notice the ladder at the right side of Figure 5. This ascending series of boxes represents a final sequence of advances which can commence after preliminary hurdles have been cleared. The stages in this sequence correspond to whole brain emulations of successfully more neurologically sophisticated model organisms, for example, C. elegans, honeybee, mouse, rhesus monkey, human. Because the gaps between these rungs, at least after the first step, are mostly quantitative in nature and due mainly, though not entirely, to the differences in sizes of the brains to be emulated, they should be tractable through a relatively straightforward scale-up of scanning and simulation capacity. Once we start ascending the final ladder, the eventual attainment of human whole brain emulation becomes more clearly foreseeable. We can thus expect to get some advance warning before arrival at human-level machine intelligence along the whole brain emulation path. At least if the last among the requisite enabling technologies to reach sufficient maturity is either high throughput scanning or the computational power needed for real-time simulation. If, however, the last enabling technology to fall into place is neurocomputational modeling, then the transition from unimpressive prototypes to a working human emulation could be more abrupt. One could imagine a scenario in which, despite abundant scanning data and fast computers, it is proving difficult to get our neuronal models to work right. When finally the last glitch is ironed out, what was previously a completely dysfunctional system, analogs perhaps to an unconscious brain undergoing a grand mal seizure, might snap into a coherent wakeful state. In this case, the key advance would not be heralded by a series of functioning animal emulations of increasing magnitude, proving the newspaper headlines of correspondingly escalating font size, provoking. Even for those paying attention, it might be difficult to tell in advance of success just how many flaws remained in the neurocomputational models at any point, and how long it would take to fix them, even up to the eve of the critical breakthrough. Once a human whole brain emulation has been achieved, further potentially explosive developments would take place. But we postponed that to Chapter 4. Surprise scenarios are thus imaginable for whole brain emulation, even if all the relevant research were conducted in the open. Nevertheless, compared with the AI path to machine intelligence, whole brain emulation is more likely to be preceded by clear elements, since it relies more on concrete, observable technologies, and is not wholly based on theoretical insight. We can also say, with greater confidence than for the AI path, that the emulation path will not succeed in the near future, within the next 15 years or so, because we know that several challenging precursor technologies have not yet been developed. By contrast, it seems likely that somebody could in principle sit down and code a seed AI on an ordinary present-day personal computer, and it is conceivable, though unlikely, that somebody somewhere will get the right insight for how to do this in the near future. What's the discussion about? This is about... Well, now we're moving on to biological cognition, but just now we were talking about uploading a brain to a cloud. Or rather, how do we perfectly simulate a brain? And how far away are we from that? Biological cognition. A third path to greater than current human intelligence is to enhance the functioning of biological brains. In principle, this could be achieved without technology, through selective breeding. Any attempt to initiate a classical large-scale eugenics program, however, would confront major political and moral hurdles. Moreover, unless the selection were extremely strong, many generations would be required to produce substantial results. Long before such an initiative would bear fruit, advances in biotechnology would allow much more direct control of human genetics and neurobiology, rendering otiose any human breeding program. We will therefore focus on methods that hold the potential to deliver results faster, on the timescale of a few generations or less. Our individual cognitive capacities can be strengthened in various ways, including by such traditional methods as education and training. Neurological development can be promoted by low-tech interventions such as optimizing maternal and infant nutrition, removing lead and other neurotoxic pollutants from the environment, eradicating parasites, ensuring adequate sleep and exercise, and preventing diseases that affect the brain. Improvements in cognition can certainly be obtained through each of these means, though the magnitudes of the gains are likely to be modest, especially in populations that are already reasonably well-nourished and schooled. We will certainly not achieve superintelligence by any of these means, but they might help on the margin, particularly by lifting up the deprived and expanding the catchment of global talent. Lifelong depression of intelligence due to iodine deficiency remains widespread in many impoverished inland areas of the world, an outrage given that the condition can be prevented by fortifying table salt at a cost of a few cents per person and year. That's interesting. Anyways. Biomedical enhancements could give bigger boosts. Drugs already exist that are alleged to improve memory, concentration, and mental energy in at least some subjects. Work on this book was fueled by coffee and nicotine chewing gum. While the efficacy of the present generation of smart drugs is variable, marginal, and generally dubious, future nootropics might offer clearer benefits and fewer side effects. However, it seems implausible on both neurological and evolutionary grounds that one could, by introducing some chemical into the brain of a healthy person, spark a dramatic rise in intelligence. The cognitive function of a human brain, depends on a delicate orchestration of many factors, especially during the critical stages of embryo development, and it is much more likely that this self-organizing structure, to be enhanced, needs to be carefully balanced, tuned, and cultivated, rather than simply flooded with some extraneous potion. Manipulation of genetics will provide a more powerful set of tools than psychopharmacology. Consider again the idea of genetic selection. Instead of trying to implement a eugenics program by controlling mating patterns, one could use selection at the level of embryos or gametes. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis has already been used in vitro fertilization procedures to screen embryos produced for monogenic disorders such as Huntington's disease and for predisposition to some late-onset disease such as breast cancer. It has also been used for sex selection and for matching human leukocyte antigen type with that of a sick sibling who can then benefit from a cord blood stem cell donation when the new baby is born. The range of traits that can be selected for or against will expand greatly over the next decade or two. A strong driver of progress in behavioral genetics is the rapidly falling cost of genotyping and gene sequencing. Genome-wide complex trait analysis using studies with vast number of subjects is just now starting to become feasible and will greatly increase our knowledge of the genetic architectures of human cognitive and behavioral traits. Any trait with a non-negligible heritability, including cognitive capacity, could then become susceptible to selection. Embryo selection does not require a deep understanding of the causal pathways by which genes, in complicated interplay with environments, produce phenotypes. It requires only lots of data on the genetic correlates of the traits of interest. It is possible to calculate some rough estimates of the magnitude of the gains obtainable in different selection scenarios. Table 5 shows expected increases in intelligence resulting from various amounts of selection, assuming complete information about the common additive genetic variance underlying the narrow sense heritability of intelligence. With partial information, the effectiveness of selection would be reduced, though not quite to the extent one might naively expect. Unsurprisingly, selecting between larger numbers of embryos produces larger gains, but there are steeply diminishing returns. Selection between 100 embryos does not produce a gain anywhere near 50 times as large as that which one would get from selecting between 2. Interestingly, the diminishment of returns is greatly abated when the selection is spread over multiple generations. Thus, repeatedly selecting the top 1 in 10 over 10 generations, where each new generation consists of the offspring of those selected, will produce a much greater increase in the trait value than a one-off selection of 1 in 100. That makes sense. The problem with sequential selection, of course, is that it just takes longer. If each generational step takes 20 or 30 years, then even just 5 successive generations would push us well into the 22nd century. Long before then, more direct and powerful modes of genetic engineering, not to mention machine intelligence, will most likely be available. There is, however, a complementary technology, one which, once it has been developed for use in humans, would greatly potentiate the enhancement power of pre-implantation genetic screening, namely the derivation of variable sperm and eggs from embryonic stem cells. The techniques for this have already been used to produce fertile offspring in mice and gamete-like cells in humans. Substantial scientific challenges remain, however, in translating the animal results to human and in avoiding epigenetic abnormalities in the derived stem cell lines. According to one expert, these challenges might put human application 10 or even 50 years in the future. With stem cell-derived gametes, the amount of selection power available to a couple could be greatly increased. In current practice, an in vitro fertilization procedure typically involves the creation of fewer than 10 embryos. With stem cell-derived gametes, a few donated cells might be turned into a virtually unlimited number of gametes that could be combined to produce embryos, which could then be genotyped or sequenced, and the most promising one chosen for implantation. Depending on the cost of preparing and screening each individual embryo, this technology could yield a several-fold increase in the selective power available to couples using in vitro fertilization. More importantly still, stem cell-derived gametes would allow multiple generations of selection to be compressed into less than a human maturation period by enabling iterated embryo selection. This is a procedure that would consist of the following steps: genotype and select a number of embryos that are higher in desired genetic characteristics, extract stem cells from those embryos and convert them into sperm and ova, maturing within 6 months or less, cross the new sperm and ova to produce embryos. Repeat until large genetic changes have been accumulated. In this manner, it would be possible to accomplish 10 or more generations of selection in just a few years. The procedure would be time-consuming and expensive. However, in principle, it would need to be done only once rather than repeated for each birth. The cell lines established at the end of the procedure could be used to generate very large numbers of enhanced embryos. As Table 5 indicates, the average level of intelligence among individuals conceived in this manner could be very high, possibly equal to or somewhat above that of the most intelligent individual in the historical human population. A world that had a large population of such individuals might, if it had the culture, education, communications, infrastructure, etc. to match, constitute a collective superintelligence. The impact of this technology would be dampened and delayed by several factors. There is the unavoidable maturational lag while the finally selected embryos grow into adult human beings, at least 20 years before an enhanced child reaches full productivity, longer still before such children come to constitute a substantial segment of the labor force. Furthermore, even after the technology has been perfected, adoption rates will probably start out low. Some countries might prohibit its use altogether on moral or religious grounds. Even where selection is allowed, many couples will prefer the natural way of conceiving. Willingness to use IVF, however, would increase if there were clearer benefits associated with the procedure, such as a virtual guarantee that the child would be highly talented and free from genetic predispositions to disease. Lower health care costs and high expected lifetime earnings would also argue in favor of genetic selection. As use of the procedure becomes more common, particularly among social elites, there might be a cultural shift towards parenting norms that present the use of selection as the thing that responsible, enlightened couples do. It's a scary thought. Many of the initially reluctant might join the bandwagon in order to have a child that is not at a disadvantage relative to the enhanced children of their friends and colleagues. Some countries might offer inducements to encourage their citizens to take advantage of genetic selection in order to increase the country's stock of human capital, or to increase long-term social stability by selecting for traits like docility, obedience, submissiveness, conformity, risk aversion, or cowardice outside of the ruling clan. Effects on the intellectual capacity would also depend on the extent to which the available selection power would be used for enhancing cognitive traits. Table 6. Those who do opt to use some form of embryo selection would have to choose how to allocate the selection power at their disposal, and intelligence would to some extent be in competition with other desired attributes such as health, beauty, personality, or athleticism. Iterated embryo selection, by offering such a large amount of selection power, would alleviate some of these trade-offs, enabling simultaneous strong selection for multiple traits. However, this procedure would tend to disrupt the normal genetic relationship between parents and child, something that could negatively affect demand in many cultures. With further advances in genetic technology, it may become possible to synthesize genomes to specification, obviating the need for large pools of embryos. DNA synthesis is already a routine and largely automated biotechnology, though it is not yet feasible to synthesize an entire human genome that could be used in a reproductive context, not least because of the still unresolved difficulties in getting the epigenetics right. But once this technology is matured, an embryo could be designed with the exact preferred combination of genetic inputs from each parent. Genes that are present in neither of the parents could also be spliced in, including alleles that are present with low frequency in the population but which may have significant positive effects on cognition. One intervention that becomes possible when human genomes can be synthesized is genetic spell checking of an embryo. Iterated embryo selection might also allow an approximation of this. Each of us currently carries a mutational load, with perhaps hundreds of mutations that reduce the efficiency of various cellular processes. Each individual mutation has an almost negligible effect, whence it is only slowly removed from the gene pool. Yet, in combination, such mutations may exact a heavy toll on our functioning. Individual differences in intelligence might, to a significant extent, be attributable to variations in the number and nature of such slightly deleterious alleles that each of us carries. With gene synthesis, we could take the genome of an embryo and construct a version of that genome free from the genetic noise of accumulated mutations. If one wished to speak provocatively, one could say that individuals created from such proof-free genomes might be more human than anybody currently alive, and that they would be less distorted. Oh, that's terrifying. Fuck. Sorry. That they would be less distorted expressions of human form. Such people would not all be carbon copies because humans vary genetically in ways other than by carrying different deleterious mutations. But the phenotypical manifestation of a proof-read genome may be an exceptional physical and mental constitution, with elevated functioning and polygenic trait dimensions like intelligence, health, hardiness, and appearance. A loose analogy could be made with composite faces in which the defects of the superimposed individuals are averaged out. Oof, that's creepy. Okay. Composite faces is a metaphor for spell-checked genomes. Each of the central pictures was produced by superimposing photographs of 16 different individuals, residents of Tel Aviv. Composite faces are often judged to be more beautiful than any of the individual faces of which they are composed, as idiosyncratic imperfections are averaged out. Analogously, by removing individual mutations, proofread genomes may produce people closer to Platonic ideals. Oh. Such individuals would not all be genetically identical because many genes come in multiple equally functional alleles. Proofreading would only eliminate variants arising from deleterious mutations. Other potential biotechnological techniques might also be relevant. Human reproductive cloning, once achieved, could be used to replicate the genome of exceptionally talented individuals. Uptake would be limited by the preference of most prospective parents to be biologically related to their children, yet the practice could nevertheless come to have a non-negligible impact because 1. Even a relatively small increase in the number of exceptionally talented people might have a significant effect, and 2. It is possible that some state would embark on a larger-scale eugenics program, perhaps by paying surrogate mothers. Other kinds of genetic engineering, such as the design of novel synthetic genes or insertion into the genome of promoted regions and other elements to control gene expression, might also become important over time. Even more exotic possibilities may exist, such as vats full of complexly structured, cultured cortical tissue or uplifted transgenic animals. Perhaps some large-brained mammals, such as the whale or elephant, enriched with human genes. These latter ones are wholly speculative, but over a longer time frame they perhaps cannot be completely discounted. So far, we have discussed germline interventions, ones that would be done on gametes or embryos. Somatic gene enhancements by bypassing the generation cycle could in principle produce impacts more quickly. However, they are technologically much more challenging. They require that the modified genes be inserted into a large number of cells in the living body, including, in the case of cognitive enhancement, the brain. Selecting among existing egg cells or embryos, in contrast, requires no gene insertion. Even such germline therapies as to involve modifying the genome, such as proofreading the genome or splicing in rare alleles, are far easier to implement at the gamete or embryo stage, where one is dealing with a small number of cells. Furthermore, germline interventions on embryos can probably achieve greater effects than somatic interventions on adults, because the former would be able to shape early brain development, whereas the latter would be limited to tweaking an existing structure. Some of what could be done through somatic gene therapy might also be achievable by pharmacological means. Focusing therefore on germline interventions, we must take into account the generational lag delaying any large impact on the world. Even if technology were perfected today and immediately put to use, it would take more than 2 decades for a genetically enhanced brood to reach maturity. Furthermore, with human applications, there is normally a delay of at least 1 decade between proof of concept in the laboratory and clinical application, because of the need for extensive studies to determine safety. The simplest forms of genetic selection, however, could largely abrogate the need for such testing, since they would use standard fertility treatment techniques and genetic information to choose between embryos that might otherwise have been selected by chance. Delays could also result from obstacles rooted not in a fear of failure, demand for safety testing, but in fear of success, demand for regulation driven by concerns about the moral permissibility of genetic selection or its wider social implications. Such concerns are likely to be more influential in some countries than in others, owing to differing cultural, historical, and religious contexts. Post-war Germany, for example, has chosen to give a wide berth to any reproductive practices that could be perceived to be even in the remotest way aimed at enhancement, a stance that is understandable given the particularly dark history of atrocities connected to the eugenics movement in that country. Other Western countries are likely to take a more liberal approach. And some countries, perhaps China or Singapore, both of which have long-term population policies, might not only permit but actively promote the use of genetic selection and genetic engineering to enhance the intelligence of their populations once the technology to do so is available. Once the example has been set and results start to show, holdouts will have strong incentives to follow suit. Nations would face the prospect of becoming cognitive backwaters and losing out in economic, scientific, military, and prestige contests with competitors that embrace the new human enhancement technologies. Individuals within a society would see places at elite schools being filled with genetically selected children, who may also be on average be prettier, healthier, and more conscientious, and will want their own offspring to have the same advantages. There is some chance that a large attitudinal shift could take place over a relatively short time, perhaps in as little as a decade, once the technology is proven to work and to provide a substantial benefit. Opinion surveys in the United States reveal a dramatic shift in public approval of in vitro fertilization after the birth of the first test tube baby, Louis Brown, in 1978. A few years earlier, only 18% of Americans said they would personally use IVF to treat infertility, yet in a poll taken shortly after the birth of Louis Brown, 53% said they would do so. The number has continued to rise. For comparison, in a poll taken in 2004, 28% approved of embryo selection for strength or intelligence, 58% approved of it for avoiding adult-onset cancer, and 68% approved of it to avoid fatal childhood disease. If we add up the various delays, say 5 to 10 years, to gather the information needed for significantly effective selection among a set of IVF embryos, possibly much longer before stem cell-derived gametes are available for use in human production, 10 years to build significant uptake, and 20 to 25 years for the enhanced generation to reach an age where they start becoming productive, we find that germline enhancements are unlikely to have a significant impact on society before the middle of the century. From that point onward, however, the intelligence of the significant segments of the adult population may begin to be boosted by genetic enhancements. The speed of the ascent would then greatly accelerate as cohorts conceived, using more powerful next-generation genetic technologies, in particular stem cell-derived gametes and iterative embryo selection, enter the labor force. With the full development of the genetic technologies described above, setting aside the more exotic possibilities such as intelligence and culture-neutral neural tissue, it might be possible to ensure that new individuals are on average smarter than any human who has yet existed, with peaks that rise higher still. The potential of biological enhancement is thus ultimately high, probably sufficient for the attainment of at least weak forms of superintelligence. This should not be surprising. After all, dumb evolutionary processes have dramatically amplified the intelligence in the human lineage, even compared with our close relatives, the great apes and our own humanoid ancestors, and there is no reason to suppose Homo sapiens to have reached the apex of cognitive effectiveness attainable in a biological system. Far from being the smartest possible biological species, we are probably better thought of as the stupidest possible biological species capable of starting a technological civilization. In each we failed because we got there first, not because we are in any sense optimally adapted to it. Progress along the biological path is clearly feasible. The generational lag in germline interventions means that progress could not be nearly as sudden and abrupt as in scenarios involving machine intelligence. Somatic gene therapies and pharmacological interventions could theoretically skip the generational lag, but they seem harder to perfect and are less likely to produce dramatic effects. The ultimate potential of machine intelligence is, of course, vastly greater than that of organic intelligence. One can get some sense of the magnitude of the gap by considering the speed differential between electronic components and nerve cells. Even today's transistors operate on a timescale 10 million times shorter than that of biological neurons. However, even comparatively moderate enhancements of biological cognition could have important consequences. In particular, cognitive enhancement could accelerate science and technology, including progress towards more potent forms of biological intelligence, amplification, and machine intelligence. Consider how the rate of progress in the field of artificial intelligence would change in a world where average Joe is an intellectual peer of Alan Turing or John von Neumann, and where millions of people tower far above any intellectual giant of the past. A discussion of the strategic implications of cognitive enhancement will have to wait a later chapter, but we can summarize this section by noting 3 conclusions. 1. At least weak forms of superintelligence are achievable by means of biotechnological enhancements. 2. Feasibility of cognitively enhanced humans adds to the plausibility that advanced forms of machine intelligence are feasible, because even if we were fundamentally unable to create machine intelligence, which there is no reason to suppose, machine intelligence might still be within reach of cognitively enhanced humans. And 3, when we consider scenarios stretching significantly into the second half of the century and beyond, we must take into account the probable emergence of a generation of genetically enhanced populations. Voters, inventors, scientists, with the magnitude of enhancement escalating rapidly over subsequent decades. Whew, that's weird. Okay. Brain-computer interfaces. It is sometimes proposed that direct brain-computer interfaces, particularly implants, could enable humans to exploit the fortes of digital computing. Perfect recall, speedy and accurate arithmetic calculation, and high bandwidth data transmission, enabling the resulting hybrid system to radically outperform the unaugmented brain. But although the possibility of direct connections between human brains and computers has been demonstrated, it seems unlikely that such interfaces will be widely used as enhancements anytime soon. To begin with, there are significant risks of medical complications, including infections, electrode displacement, hemorrhage, and cognitive decline when implanting electrodes in the brain. Perhaps the most vivid illustration to date of the benefits that can be obtained through brain stimulation is the treatment of patients with Parkinson's disease. The Parkinson's implant is relatively simple. It does not really communicate with the brain, but simply supplies a stimulating electric current to the subthalamic nucleus. A demonstration video shows a subject slumped in a chair, completely immobilized by the disease, then suddenly springing to life when the current is switched on. The subject now moves his arms, stands up and walks across the room, turns around and performs a pirouette. Yet even behind this especially simple and almost miraculously successful procedure, there lurk negatives. One study of Parkinson patients who received deep brain implants showed reductions in verbal fluency, selective attention, color naming, and verbal memory compared with controls. Treated subjects also reported more cognitive complaints. Such risks and side effects might be tolerable if the procedure is used to alleviate severe disability, but in order for healthy subjects to volunteer themselves for neurosurgery, there would have to be some very substantial enhancement of normal functionality to be gained. This brings us to the second reason to doubt that superintelligence will be achieved through cyborgization. Namely, that enhancement is likely to be far more difficult than therapy. Patients who suffer from paralysis might benefit from an implant that replaces their severed nerves or activates spinal motion pattern generators. Patients who are deaf or blind might benefit from artificial cochleae or retinas. Patients with Parkinson's disease or chronic pain might benefit from deep brain stimulation that excites or inhibits activity in a particular area of the brain. What seems far more difficult to achieve is a high bandwidth direct interaction between brain and computer to provide substantial increases in intelligence of a form that could not be excuse me. What seems far more difficult to achieve is a high bandwidth direct interaction between brain and computer to provide substantial increases in intelligence of a form that could not be more readily attained by other means. Most of the potential benefits that brain implants could provide in healthy subjects could be obtained at far less risk, expense, and inconvenience by using our regular motor and sensory organs to interact with computers located outside of our bodies. We do not need to plug a fiber optic cable into our brains in order to access the internet. Not only can the human retina transmit data at an impressive rate of nearly 10 million bits per second, but it comes prepackaged with a massive amount of dedicated wetware, the visual cortex, that is highly adapted to extracting meaning from this information torrent and to interfacing with other brain areas for further processing. Even if there were an easy way of pumping more information into our brains, the extra data inflow would do little to increase the rate at which we think and learn, unless all the neural machinery necessary for making sense of the data were similarly upgraded. Since this includes almost all of the brain, what would really be needed is a whole brain prosthesis, which is just another way of saying artificial general intelligence. Yet if one had a human-level AI, one could dispense with neurosurgery. A computer might as well have a metal casing as one of bone. So this limiting case just takes us back to the AI path, which we have already examined. Brain-computer interfacing has also been proposed as a way to get information out of the brain, for purposes of communicating with other brains or with machines. Such uplinks have helped patients with locked-in syndrome to communicate with the outside world by enabling them to move a cursor on a screen by thought. The bandwidth attained in such experiments is low. The patient painstakingly types out one slow letter after another at a rate of a few words per minute. One can readily imagine improved versions of this technology. Perhaps a next-generation implant could plug into a Broca's area, a region in the frontal lobe involved in language production, and pick up internal speech. But while such a technology might assist some people with disabilities induced by stroke or muscular degeneration, it would hold little appeal for healthy subjects. The functionality it would provide is essentially that of a microphone coupled with speech recognition software, which is already commercially available, minus the pain, inconvenience, expense, and risks associated with neurosurgery, and minus at least some of the hyper-Orwellian overtones of an intracranial listening device. Keeping our machines outside of our bodies also makes upgrading easier. But what about the dream of bypassing words altogether and establishing a connection between two brains that enables concepts, thoughts, or entire areas of expertise to be downloaded from one mind to another? We can download large files to our computers, including libraries with millions of books and articles, and this can be done over the course of seconds. Could something similar be done with our brains? The apparent plausibility of this idea probably derives from an incorrect view of how information is stored and represented in the brain. As noted, the rate-limiting step in human intelligence is not how fast raw data can be fed into the brain, but rather how quickly the brain can extract meaning and make sense of the data. Perhaps it will be suggested that we transmit meanings directly, rather than package them into sensory data that must be decoded by the recipient. There are two problems with this. The first is that brains, by contrast to the kinds of program we typically run on our computers, do not use standardized data storage and representation formats. Rather, each brain develops its own idiosyncratic representations of higher-level contents. Which particular neuronal assemblies are recruited to represent a particular concept depends on the unique experiences of the brain in question, along with various genetic factors and stochastic physiological processes. Just as in artificial neural nets, meaning in biological neural networks is likely represented holistically in the structure and activity patterns of sizable, overlapping regions, not in discrete memory cells laid out in neat arrays. It would therefore not be possible to establish a simple mapping between the neurons in one brain and those in another in such a way that thoughts could automatically slide over from one to the other. In order for the thoughts of one brain to be intelligible to another, the thoughts need to be decomposed and packaged into symbols according to some shared convention that allows the symbols to be correctly interpreted by the receiving brain. This is the job of language. In principle, one could imagine offloading the cognitive work of articulation and interpretation to an interface that would somehow read out the neural states in the sender's brain and somehow feed in a bespoke pattern of activation to the receiver's brain. But this brings us to the second problem with the cyborg scenario. Even setting aside the quite immense technical challenge of how to reliably read and write simultaneously from perhaps billions of individually addressable neurons, creating the requisite interface is probably an AI-complete problem. The interface would need to include a componentable in real time, map firing patterns in one brain into semantically equivalent firing patterns in the other brain. The detailed multi-level understanding of the neural computation needed to accomplish such a task would seem to directly enable neuromorphic AI. Despite these reservations, the cyborg route towards cognitive enhancement is not entirely without promise. Impressive work on the rat hippocampus has demonstrated the feasibility of a neural prosthesis that can enhance performance in a simple working memory task. In its present version, the implant collects input from a dozen or two electrodes located in one area, CA3, of the hippocampus, and projects onto a similar number of neurons in another area, CA1. A microprocessor is trained to discriminate between two different firing patterns in the first area, corresponding to two different memories, right lever or left lever, and to learn how these patterns are projected into the second area. This prosthesis can not only restore function when the normal neural connection between the two neural areas is blockaded, but by sending an especially clear token of a particular memory pattern to the second area, it can enhance the performance on the memory task beyond what the rat is normally capable of. While a technical tour de force by contemporary standards, the study leaves many challenging questions unanswered. How well does the approach scale to greater numbers of memories? How well can we control the combinatorial explosion that otherwise threatens to make learning the correct mapping infeasible as the number of input and output neurons is increased? Does the enhanced performance on the test task come at some hidden costs, such as reduced ability to generalize from the particular stimulus used in the experiment, or reduced ability to unlearn the association when the environment changes? Would the test subjects still somehow benefit if, unlike rats, they could avail themselves of external memory aids such as pen and paper? And how much harder would it be to apply a similar method to other parts of the brain? Whereas the present prosthesis takes advantage of the relatively simple feed-forward structure of parts of the hippocampus, basically serving as a unidirectional bridge between areas CA3 and CA1, other structures in the cortex involve convoluted feedback loops, which greatly increase the complexity of the wiring diagram and, presumably, the difficulty of deciphering the functionality of any embedded group of neurons. One hope for the cyborg route is that the brain, if permanently implanted with a device connecting it to some external resource, would over time learn an effective mapping between its own internal cognitive states and the inputs it receives from, or the outputs accepted by, the device. Then the implant itself would not need to be intelligent, rather the brain would intelligently adapt to the interface, much as the brain of an infant gradually learns to interpret the signals arriving from receptors in its eyes and ears. But here again, one must question how much would really be gained. Suppose that the brain's plasticity were such that it could learn to detect patterns in some new arbitrary projected onto some parts of the cortex by means of a brain-computer interface. Why not project the same information onto the retina instead, as a visual pattern, or onto the cochlea as it sounds? The low-tech alternatives avoid 1,000 complications, and in either case the brain could deploy its pattern recognition mechanisms and plasticity to learn to make sense of the information. Networks and organizations. Another conceivable path to superintelligence is through the gradual enhancement of networks and organizations that link individual human minds with one another with various artifacts and bots. The idea here is not that this would enhance the intellectual capacity of individuals enough to make them superintelligent, but rather that some system composed of individuals, thus networked and organized, might attain a form of superintelligence. What in the next chapter we will elaborate as collective superintelligence. Humanity has gained enormously in collective intelligence over the course of history and prehistory. The gains come from many sources, including innovations in communications technology, such as writing and printing, and above all the introduction of language itself, increases in the size of the world population and the density of habitation, various improvements in organizational techniques and epistemic norms, and a gradual accumulation of institutional capital. In general terms, a system's collective intelligence is limited by the abilities of its members' minds, the overheads in communicating relevant information between them, and the various distortions and inefficiencies that pervade human organizations. If communication overheads are reduced, including not only equipment costs, but also response latencies, time and attention burdens, and other factors, then larger and more densely connected organizations become feasible. The same could happen if fixes are found for some of the bureaucratic deformations that warp organizational life: wasteful status games, mission creep, concealment, or falsification of information, and other agency problems. Even partial solutions to these problems could pay hefty dividends for collective intelligence. The technological and institutional innovations that could contribute to the growth of our collective intelligence are many and various. For example, subsidized prediction markets might foster truth-seeking norms and improve forecasting on contentious, scientific and social issues. Lie detectors, should it prove feasible to make ones that are reliable and easy to use, could reduce the scope for deception in human affairs. Self-deception detectors might even be more powerful. Even without newfangled brain technologies, some forms of deception might become harder to practice thanks to the increased availability of many kinds of data, including reputations and track records, or the promulgation of strong epistemic norms and rationality culture. Voluntary and involuntary surveillance will amass vast amounts of information about human behavior. Social networking sites are already used by over 1 billion people to share personal details. Soon, these people might begin uploading continuous live recordings from microphones and video cameras embedded in their smartphones or eyeglass frames. Automated analysis of such data streams will enable many new applications, sinister as well as benign, of course. Oh, it's happening, yep. Growth in collective intelligence may also come from more general organizational and economic improvements, and from enlarging the fractions of the world's population that is educated, digitally connected, and integrated into global intellectual culture. The internet stands out as a particularly dynamic frontier for innovation and experimentation. Most of its potential may still remain unexploited. Continuing development of an intelligent web with better support for deliberation, debiasing, and judgment aggregation might make large contributions to increasing the collective intelligence of humanity as a whole or of particular groups. But what of the seemingly more fanciful idea that the internet might one day wake up? Could the internet become something more than just the backbone of a loosely integrated collective superintelligence, something more like a virtual skull housing an emerging unified superintellect? This was one of the ways that superintelligence could arise, according to Werner Vinge's influential 1993 essay, which coined the term technological singularity. Against this, one could object that machine intelligence is hard enough to achieve through arduous engineering, and that it is incredible to suppose that it will arise spontaneously. However, the story need not be that some future version of the internet suddenly becomes super intelligent by mere happenstance. A more plausible version of the scenario could be that the internet accumulates improvements through the work of many people over many years, work to engineer better search and information filtering algorithms, more powerful data representation formats, more capable autonomous software agents, and more efficient protocols governing the interaction between such bots, and that myriad incremental improvements eventually create the basis for some more unified form of web intelligence. It seems at least conceivable that such a web-based cognitive system, supersaturated with computer power and all other resources needed for explosive growth save for one crucial ingredient, could, when the final missing constituent is dropped into the cauldron, blaze up with superintelligence. This type of scenario, though, converges into another possible path to superintelligence, that of artificial general intelligence, which we have already discussed. Summary. The fact that there are many paths that lead to superintelligence should increase our confidence that we will eventually get there. If one path turns out to be blocked, we can still progress. That there are multiple paths does not entail that there are multiple destinations. Even if significant intelligence amplification were first achieved along one of the non-machine intelligence paths, this would not render machine intelligence irrelevant. Quite the contrary. Enhanced biological or organizational intelligence would accelerate scientific and technological developments, potentially hastening the arrival of more radical forms of intelligence and amplification, such as whole brain emulation and AI. This is not to say that it is a matter of indifference how we get to machine superintelligence. The path taken to get there could make a big difference to the eventual outcome, even if the ultimate capabilities that are obtained do not depend much on the trajectory, how those capabilities will be used, how much control humans have over their disposition, for example. Might as well, excuse me, might well depend on details of our approach. For example, enhancements of biological or organizational intelligence might increase our ability to anticipate risk and to design machine superintelligence that is safe and beneficial. A full strategic assessment involves many complexities, and we'll have to wait chapter 14. True superintelligence, as opposed to marginal increases in current levels of intelligence, might plausibly first be attained via the AI path. There are, however, many fundamental uncertainties along this path. This makes it difficult to rigorously assess how long the path is or how many obstacles there are along the way. The whole brain emulation path also has some chance of being the quickest route to superintelligence. Since progress along this path requires mainly incremental technological advances rather than theoretical breakthroughs, a strong case can be made that it will eventually succeed. It seems fairly likely, however, that even if progress along the whole brain emulation path is swift, artificial intelligence will nevertheless be first to cross the finishing line. This is because the possibility of neuromorphic AIs based on partial emulations. Biological cognitive enhancements are clearly feasible, particularly ones based on genetic selection. Iterated embryo selection currently seems like an especially promising technology. Compared with possible breakthroughs in machine intelligence, however, biological enhancements would be relatively slow and gradual. They would, at best, result in relatively weak forms of superintelligence. More on this shortly. The clear feasibility of biological enhancement should increase our confidence that machine intelligence is ultimately achievable, since enhanced human scientists and engineers will be able to make more and faster progress than their all-natural counterparts. Especially in scenarios in which machine intelligence is delayed beyond mid-century, the increasingly cognitively enhanced cohorts coming on stage will play a growing role in subsequent developments. Brain-computer interfaces look unlikely as a source of superintelligence. Improvements in networks and organizations might result in weakly superintelligent forms of collective intelligence in the long run, but more likely they will play an enabling role similar to that of biological cognitive enhancement, gradually increasing humanity's effective ability to solve intellectual problems. Compared with biological enhancements, advances in networks and organization will make a difference sooner. In fact, such advances are occurring continuously and are having a significant impact already. However, improvements in networks and organizations may yield narrower increases in our problem-solving capacity than will improvements in biological cognition, boosting collective intelligence rather than quality intelligence. To anticipate a distinction we are about to introduce in the next chapter. Next chapter is chapter 3, Forms of Superintelligence. What they would look like. So, that was chapter 1. It's been about 3 hours. That was chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom. Chapter 1, of course, being the Chapter 1 being about the past developments of the whole history and timeline of AI as it is. And the second bit, paths to superintelligence, how we can get there. So he talked about artificial intelligence, whole brain emulation, uploading the brain to the cloud or computer or whatever. Biological cognition, which is just, well, eugenics. Brain computer interfaces, cyborgy stuff, networks and organizations, and finally the summary of those things. That was an interesting first bit of a read. I assume and anticipate that most people are not conscious right now. That's my guess. That'd be my guess. Yep, seems about right. Yes. So far, my thoughts are, I think he's a little optimistic about some things, like really optimistic. He's definitely got, you can definitely feel the transhumanist views from him a little bit from reading the works, which I personally don't know if I can vibe with just yet. But I want to I want to see where this is coming from and going so I can critique it properly. Is it weird that it got unethical by the end of chapter 2? I don't think it's weird at all. I also thought it was like unethical, and I think he understands as well that this breaches into paths that are controversial. This breaches into the controversial and the maybe ethical, maybe unethical. Right? This happens, as he understands, and he expresses a bit too keenly. It's scary to think about. It's weird to think about. It's kind of cool though, in a way. I wish I was exploring this concept in like a sci-fi novel and not like a straight up like philosophy book that's like, written by a contemporary, very well-respected philosopher that's like, this shit's happening in like 50 years, or this shit is happening in the next 25 years. Like, right now we're in 2025. We are closer to 2050 than we are 2000. We are closer to 2050 than we are the year 2000. 2050 is when the predictions of all of these scientists have said we're gonna, get to this. And before you go, oh well, their predictions are wholly wrong, they have made other predictions that were way off the mark in the other way. Like they underestimated how quickly things would progress in some of their other predictions. So it's, I'm scared. But it's a cool, interesting read so far. I will continue to read it at least for another like 2 chapters, I think. But I'm not sure if I'll continue after that because it feels very like hard to read. This feels like a very hard to read book. But the thing is, like, there's so much of this book that should be read in order for you to get it. But it's also like 400 pages. I read like 70 pages today. So, if we do 5 more streams, or if we do 2 chapters each. Hold on, no. So it's if we do 2 chapters per stream, we've done the first 2, so there's like 13 left. We would have around 6 streams to get through the whole book. Could I do 6 streams of this book? Yeah, I could. I did like 8 Date Everything streams. I could do 6 streams of Nick Bostrom. I could do it. And I think I want to commit to that idea too. But I don't know. I'm bad at committing to things, as you might understand. Got quite lost with the mentioning of various paths towards it. Explains how inevitable it is quite interesting. Yes, it is. And it's definitely his stance that at the time, I think in 2014, a lot of the literature not caution, but a lot of the literature was speculative or skeptical of whether or not we will reach a superintelligence. But him outlining all the ways that can be achieved and how they can all kind of converge together. So it might not necessarily be one thing. It might not necessarily be pure like AI. It might not necessarily be pure whole brain emulation, biological cognition, brain computer interfaces, networks and organizations. But it could be like a convergence of those things as well. And one might be slower than the other, but that just means that either way, it's less like it is less if superintelligence is possible, and more when is possible. It's a very strong like meta argument in this small. It's a very small. It's a very strong, larger, overarching argument that he makes over these small ones, which I guess is the backbone of philosophical discourse, right? I mean, you know, it's so far really compelling, despite it being really difficult and me not understanding probably like at least 40% of what I was reading. I straight up was like, I don't know what this means. I'm just reading the words and hopefully it makes sense. And over time it made a bit more sense as I read it a bit more. But like, oh man, that was kind of rough. You fear commitment, that's why you're married in your 60s? Okay, alright. I guess that's time to end stream now. Thank you everyone for joining me. I understand this is gonna be less interesting and fun than, you know, oh, Detroit Become Human, where we react to like androids sent by Cyberlife. But this is important, and I don't care if people don't. I don't care if people don't watch this, because I know people don't care. I know most people are gonna be like, this is fucking boring. We're reading a book. I hate reading books. But you have to understand that I'm doing this for you and for me. I'm doing this for me, so I'm reading. So I keep my brain sharp enough. And also, I now get to morally grandstand over everyone who tries to... I now get to grandstand over other people who have opinions on AI by telling them, oh yeah, well, did you read... Are you familiar with the works of Nick Bostrom? I thought not. You know, like, I could do that by reading, like, 2 chapters of one of his books. So, there we go. Thanks. That's about it for today's stream. I'll continue doing these, I think. Hopefully, I will. I will put up a schedule soon for how the rest of the week's gonna go. Give me a little bit of time for that. I will see everyone probably not tomorrow, but definitely on Wednesday. Okay? Great. Don't ask anything from me. Don't expect anything from me. And please read a book. Thank you and goodbye.